Well, hey there, folks. Welcome to The Sacred Speaks. My name is John Price. I'm your host. Today, I have a very exciting episode with Dr. Wouter Hanegraaff, somebody who basically I've been waiting for a long time to reach out to and connect with. I've been trying to get myself ready for this one, and it did not disappoint. I'm going to introduce him in a second, but for now, I'm going to get you a couple of updates on what's going on in this world, and then we'll get to the introduction and then to the episode. So first of all, as always, check out The Sacred Speaks at thesacredspeaks.com. The website is almost ready. I know I've been saying that for a very long time. I have not done this before, and I assure you, when I say it's going to be ready in 2 months, I really think it is. But hopefully, fingers crossed, we will have this sucker out and ready in the next couple of months. I am very much looking forward to it. The website is awesome, and the folks doing it have been amazing. Brandon Alcorn at Alcorn Agency, thank you very much. So check out The Sacred Speaks. Check out the Center for the Healing Arts and Sciences, boutique integrative clinic that my wife and I started years ago, and we're up to some cool things. So that's very interesting to figure out kind of healing in this community, certainly down in Houston. Also, another shout out to Young Center in Houston. Check it out, younghouston.org. Lots of great classes going on there, both in person and at a distance. If you're looking for something cool to do, some cool class to enrich your state of experience in this life, then check out the Young Center. It's a cool place to do some small classes, workshops, 4-week classes. Music is from Modern Nations. Check them out at modernnationsmusic.com. Hang out till the end of the episode, and you will hear a song from Modern Nations called Clouds, theme song of the podcast. Okay. Oh, yeah, just a note. Somebody online I was just interacting with posted on the comments section about all these episodes on psychedelics and having access to psychedelics. And everybody, of course, has different access in different states and, also just who you know. And so I want to put this out there and say, first of all, this is not ever an endorsement of using any of these substances. These are risky substances. So anytime you do so with that awareness and hopefully with some established and respected guides that you can not only have the experience with, but integrate with. That's what we're going to talk a little bit about today. But I do want to also note that these kinds of processes are not restricted to only psychedelics. Psychedelics and alternate states of consciousness via drugs was one mode of transitioning your state of consciousness. I just participated in a holotropic breathwork session, and it was totally radical. So I think there are all kinds of ways, and that's really what this text is looking at, is a spiritual path, a real spiritual path that doesn't point toward a particular ideology, but points toward an experiential nature of kind of creating an opportunity for the nature of your nature to express itself, which is kind of interesting. Okay, so now to Wouter. This book is amazing. It's expensive. He notes it. It's actually gone down in price since I bought it, but it's coming out in paperback. I highly recommend it. I think it's a fantastic read, and I want the hardback. Hermetic Spirituality and the Historical Imagination, Altered States of Knowledge in Late Antiquity. Check that out. And now to Wouter. Wouter Hanegraaff is Professor of History of Hermetic Philosophy and Related Currents at the University of Amsterdam, the Netherlands, a member of the Royal Dutch Academy of Arts and Sciences, as well as past president and now honorary member of the European Society for the Study of Western Esotericism. Alongside numerous articles, he is the author of New Age Religion and Western Culture, Esotericism in the Mirror of Secular Thought from 1996. Lodovico, that's the Hermetic Writings and Related Documents. Oh yeah, he goes on. He tells me not to read all this stuff, but he's got a lot of cool stuff. Just to give you a peek. Esotericism in the Academy, Rejected Knowledge in Western Culture, 3 Perspectives on Swedenborg, Oettinger, Kant, 3 Perspectives on the Secrets of Heaven. Holy moly. A Guide for the Perplexed. He's co-edited 8 collective volumes, including the 1,200-page Dictionary of Gnosis and Western Esotericism, again and again, with a shared friend of ours. Thank you, Jeff, by the way, how I got connected with Wouter. Jeff Kripal, Hidden Intercourse, Eros and Sexuality in the History of Western Esotericism with Jeff Kripal. His most recent monograph, Hermetic Spirituality, of course, the book today. His current projects are focused on the history of consciousness in German idealism and romanticism and the role of the imagination in Western culture. Holy moly! He's a total badass and just a real treat to talk to. So thank you, Wouter, for your time and certainly for this book. As you all will see, I did a bit of kind of freaking out. I got really excited about this stuff. So, and I am really excited about this stuff. So thanks, Wouter. And thank you for listening. Please share, like, do all the things. Check out the Instagram. More to come soon. I'm really stoked about this work that's happening. A lot of stuff bubbling up here. So hang in there and keep watching and keep tuning in. And for now, we'll leave it there. Dr. Wouter Hanegraaff. Am I saying that correctly?
Yeah, you say it correctly. Hanegraaff, yes. No, I get all kinds of strange pronunciations, but Hanegraaff is quite good. Yeah.
Thank you. So welcome. As I was saying earlier, I'm really moved by this text, and it happens to follow an important trend and path that I'm on. And it directed me into a lot of this Hermetic spirituality. I mean, I'm definitely the consumer who reads the footnotes and the bibliography, and I order books. So Amazon is unfortunately very supported by my my addiction to these books. And your book was quite unique in that way, that I think I ordered about 10 books. And so I thank you so much. Let me show it to the audience real quick. This is the book we'll be talking about. Hermetic Spirituality and the Historical Imagination. Say that again?
Yeah, let me say that I apologize in advance for the price. It's very expensive.
It's very expensive.
Yeah, you know, academic books get so expensive these days. All I can say is that pretty soon, hopefully next year, there will be a paperback. So it will get better. Good. But for the moment, it's an expensive book.
It is, yeah. And though I dove in, and I'm grateful for the fact that I did. So I want to start here, and as we said, we're just going to meander together. And to confirm, we have, what's the timeline that we've got? What's your?
I have 3 hours maximum.
Okay, good. I think we'll need 2. Usually, I notice that it's about 2 hours. So thank you for that time.
Sure.
So I want to start with the title here, and a lot is in a title, and I know you probably, the title didn't just come by insight, but the 3 different concepts, or 4 really, that you're bringing together. What is Hermeticism? What is spirituality? And you put something interesting, historical imagination as opposed to imagination. And altered states of knowledge. So let's kind of take that apart and dig into it a bit.
Yeah, sure.
So let's start with Hermetic spirituality.
Yeah, right. Yeah, now, like you said, the title, I thought long and deep about the title because it should encapsulate what the book is all about. It's true. Well, basically, you know, so it's a book about... you know, it's for a general audience, just as a kind of introduction. It is a book about texts from the first centuries that were written under the Roman Empire in Egypt. And they are called Hermetic because they are attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, who was this kind of legendary wise man, the kind of an ultimate authority of spiritual wisdom, as he was seen at the time. And so these are texts that are written by people who saw themselves as followers of Hermes. And so that's where the term Hermetic comes from. There has been a lot of research over about more than a century, 120 years basically, beginning from the 21st century. These are famous texts, and there has been a lot of research about them by scholars, but I was not satisfied by the outcomes, by the basic picture of how these texts were depicted. So they're famous, but I think they have been miscategorized as Hermetic philosophy. So usually, most of the scholarship will talk about Hermetic philosophy. And I I want to change the narrative basically with this book by saying, no, this is not, these are not philosophical texts in a way that we understand philosophy nowadays. And I would call them spiritual. And there are several reasons for this, but one reason is that, well, one reason I might, explain at a very, crucial example, and something that I keep coming back to in the book. There is a Greek word that is being used all the time throughout the Hermetic literature, which we do not have a good equivalent for in our language, and the Greek word is nous, and it's at the origin of words like noetic. So we have this English word noetic, a kind of knowledge. But the problem is, if you read the Hermetic literature, then the word nous and noetic and noesis, all words based upon the same concept, are all over the place. You find them everywhere. They're central to the text. And they always get translated as intellect or mind. And the problem, and this is where I begin with in the book, is that when you and I, when most of us nowadays in modern culture, when we read about intellects or minds, then we think that's something in the brain that has to do with philosophy, with intellectual, discussions, etc., etc. And but actually, it's a mistranslation. So these texts are not about that kind of stuff. They are not about philosophical reasoning, about rational discourse, and those kind of things. They are about a type of knowing, a type of knowledge, often referred to as gnosis, which is said precisely to go beyond reason, beyond rationality. And so if you talk about Hermetic philosophy, and if you translate those words as intellect or mind, then it all looks very rational and very philosophical according to our modern understandings of philosophy. And you basically, immediately start misinterpreting what these texts are all about. That is a basic argument that I'm making. So instead of philosophy, I think we're dealing with a kind of spirituality. Now, of course, what does spirituality mean? It's of course also a loaded term. I'm aware of that. But so what I'm saying is that these are not the texts of a kind of armchair philosophers sitting there in Roman Egypt talking about interesting metaphysical questions and so on. That is not what they were doing. They were using philosophy for very practical ends. They wanted to attain gnosis, higher salvational, absolute even knowledge, or insight or understanding. And they were using, of course, the language that was available to them in that time. And, I make comparisons sometimes about, let's say, with contemporary, let's say, New Age or related kind of spiritual movements. I've written a book about the New Age movement a long time ago. And if you have modern or contemporary practitioners, they may be using, modern terminology taken from psychology, popular psychology, or maybe quantum mechanics and those kind of things. That doesn't mean that they are psychologists or that they are quantum physicists. They are just using that language to talk about spiritual processes. And in a similar kind of way, these people were not philosophers in our understanding of the term. They were spiritual practitioners who were using the language that was available, which was a language of Platonism and other philosophical currents at the time. But so my point is here that we have to approach these texts in a very different way from how they have been approached so far. So not as philosophical texts, but as the texts that give us a glimpse, kind of a window on a very intense experience-oriented practice that was going on in Roman Egypt in the 2nd and the 3rd centuries. And so it's still possible to get an idea of what these people were doing, but it was about experiential phenomena, which ultimately have to be experienced in order to be understood. And that was a point that they kept emphasizing, in the text, if you read them correctly. So gnosis is often translated as, usually translated as knowledge, right? It's a form of knowledge. But, maybe this is a small detail, but I think an important detail. English does a pretty poor job in translating knowledge. I mean, if you, so we have the word knowledge. But if you look at other modern languages like German or French, then you see that there are two different words for knowledge, and that you can differentiate in German or French or Italian and so on, but not in English. And the difference is that, for instance, in German, you can say you have kennen and wissen. In French, you have connaître and savoir. These are different understandings of knowledge. So one of them means, let's say, propositional knowledge, like the kind of stuff that so I know things because I've studied these books, and I've studied physics, so I know physics, right? Those kind of things. That's one understanding of knowledge. And the other one is knowledge by direct acquaintance. And I think that's very important. Knowledge by direct acquaintance. And this means like, I know that person. Like say, a very good friend of mine that I've known for many years, somebody says, do you know the person? Yes, I really know him. Yeah, because I've been acquainted with him and I know who he is. That is not propositional knowledge. That is direct knowledge by acquaintance. So I know John or I know Mary or whatever. It's not the same thing as I know things about Mary or I know things about John. Another example I've used sometimes, let's say, the example of the White House in Washington. Yes, do we know about the White House? Yes, it's the seat of the President of the United States and so on. That is knowledge. That is propositional knowledge. So you know all kinds of things about the White House. But in order to know the White House, you must have been there. And so, so the President of the United States actually knows the White House because he knows it. That's knowledge by direct acquaintance. These are two different understandings. And the gnosis, which is central to the Hermetic literature, is knowledge by direct acquaintance. So what it actually is all about cannot be put down in words. You cannot formulate it. You cannot really transmit it through language. It's the kind of knowledge that you only get if you've actually been there, if you've seen it, if you've experienced it directly. In the same way that you know a person because you have experienced that person. In the same way, this is about knowing things that cannot be transmitted, that cannot be transmitted at all, but can only be known, because you have been there. So these people were really practitioners, and I try to outline the kind of spiritual practice that they were involved in, and which finally should lead to this ultimate experience of direct knowledge, direct seeing the true nature of reality. And a very important part of the story is that so actually that leads me to the subtitle, altered state of knowledge. Well, of course, it plays on the well-known term altered state of consciousness, right? So this is a well-known, altered state of consciousness, which are quite an important topic that I find fascinating. So you have different ways of consciousness. You can modify your consciousness by all kinds of means, by meditation, by loud music, by sensory deprivation, by psychedelic substances, by all kinds of ways, modifying consciousness. But I talk about altered states of knowledge because I argue that what you can know, the kind of knowledge that's available to you, it depends on the state of consciousness that you're in. Altered state of knowledge lead to altered state of knowledge. So if I want to do scholarly research, I need a sober kind of consciousness. I must be wide awake. I must have slept well. My consciousness must be sober and in a certain way. And that allows me to do the work that you need to do as a scholar. So that's a certain kind of knowledge. But these people were talking about forms of knowledge that required a different kind of consciousness. And so they had developed techniques for changing, for modifying their state of consciousness. And only in that way did they get access to a kind of knowledge that would not be available to them otherwise, or in any other kind of way. And what they're actually saying, and that is quite radical, is that the human soul, according to them, originally has perfect consciousness. So we have perfect knowledge. Where we came from, we knew exactly how things were. So the things that really are, reality as it really is. So we had that knowledge, but then they described that our soul gets, descends into the body. It goes through all the planetary spheres, according to the cosmos as an automatic. So you go down through these spheres, and then what happens is that your consciousness gets altered by embodiment. Yeah. And so what they're actually saying, and this is quite radical, is that all of us right now at this very moment, our consciousness has been altered. We are actually living in a state of hallucination right now. And the real non-altered state is the disembodied state.
Yes.
And our embodied state is a state of hallucination. Yeah. So if we think that our normal consciousness, in which we are talking with each other right now, is the baseline state, and then you can modify it or change it, then you actually have it the wrong side of the stick. So you have it the wrong way. It's actually the other way around. So actually, what they were trying to do, they had to develop techniques for how do you say that, for reversing this alteration of consciousness and leading the soul back to its pure state of direct knowledge, gnosis. That's what their path was all about, the path of Hermes.
Yeah, Kingsley mentions at the beginning of Catafalque the archetype of the human, and these two links are so important that we're kind of living out that humanness, and we suffer as humans suffer, and these practitioners liberating themselves from the embodiment, and I don't want to say entrapment, but the embodiment of what it means to truly be a human, and what it means to be some kind of sliver of the all expressing itself through a human experience. That's vastly different than our. It's vastly different than the shit that I grew up with. I'll tell you that, man.
I mean, the worldview that you find here, the metaphysics, is completely different. This is a completely different way of thinking from what we are used to. It's radical, but it is completely consistent in its own terms. It's a really an alternative way of thinking as compared to, let's say, standard materialist scientific worldviews. It's really a different metaphysics, and it's consistent.
It's amazing. Well, let's pause here for a second, because that gets into some territory that one thing we didn't do is do an introduction of you, and I think your path has been so interested in looking at the ways in which this humanness and our pursuit of this propositional knowledge has maybe in ways continued to leave more residue that helps us in the process of forgetting our inheritance, our natural inheritance of consciousness. And so would you give us a bit of a bio of who you are, and then we'll dive back into this book, because I'd like to go into this story that you offered in Alexandria with the priestly class that were setting up these procedural. If you'll just speak about yourself, and then we can dive into that.
All right. Space. Okay. I'll just take a little bit of water now.
Of course.
Well, okay. So what have I been doing? I defended my dissertation in 1995 at the University of Amsterdam, and it was about the New Age movement. And this was a time when the New Age was very popular at the time. Nowadays, this kind of everybody knows about this alternative spiritual things and so on. But at that time, there was a lot of concern, a lot of discussion about the New Age. What is it? Because it had become so popular during the 1980s. And so, commercialized also. So there was a lot of discussion about it. And what I was doing at the time is that I was surprised. I didn't know much about New Age. So I've never been an insider or a practitioner. I was just interested. I was walking into these bookshops New Age bookshops. I saw all this literature. I wanted to know, what is this? Where does this come from? What should I make of this? And I wanted to understand that. What shocked me at the time, really shocked me, is that when I was looking for scholarly literature, almost all of it was sociological, which was fine, but only a sociological perspective. And nobody seemed to be interested in finding out what these people were actually saying, what they were thinking. Nobody had read the literature. So there was all these books on the bookshops, on the bookshelves, in New Age bookshops. Nobody had read it. So I wanted to know, what are these people saying? So that was my dissertation. And so I made a very quite complex analysis of, well, what are these people saying? What do they believe about the nature of reality? What do they think about knowledge, about God or angels or the human self, and so on and so forth. So all the aspects. So I made a kind of systematic analysis of New Age worldviews. And then I also wanted to know, where does it come from? So I, in the second part, I sketched that these ideas actually didn't come from nowhere. They have backgrounds in what we nowadays call Western esotericism. And so basically esoteric movements, traditions that can be traced from antiquity through the present. And I discovered at that time that, the study of esotericism, basically didn't exist in the academy. There were no chairs, no programs or anything for that. So there was this esoteric stuff, but academics just looked the other way. They didn't know what to do with it. They knew everything about Christian theology. They knew everything about science and philosophy, but they didn't know about these traditions. And if I looked for scholarly literature, I couldn't find it, or very little. And so I wanted to do something about it. So basically, the New Age book was my window into this exploration that I've been pursuing ever since. So what is this kind of worldview? What are these people saying, and where does it come from? Those were the two things. And okay, then I got extremely lucky. This was the break of my life, I have to say. I feel deeply privileged because it so happened that a new chair was created in 1999 at the University of Amsterdam. It was based upon a donation, a very large donation, which made it possible for the first time to actually, study esotericism in an academic context. And I was very lucky I applied, of course, and I got a chair. So that's where I still am. And so we were able to create a whole program together with my colleagues in the study of esotericism. And so this was new. It was the first program of that kind worldwide, and it still is, I would say, the leading program. So what happened in 1999 was the kind of miracle of my life. I had defended my dissertation in 1995. I was a postdoc. I didn't know what kind of future, if any, I would have in the academy. And suddenly there was this opening in the city where I was born, in Amsterdam itself. There was suddenly this unique chair in Western esotericism. Technically, it's called History of Hermetic Philosophy and Related Currents. So they have the Hermetic in them. So that's what I'm doing. And so then...
would you define esotericism for folks that don't know that?
Yeah, well, let me come to that in a moment, because It's a very important question, but maybe I can answer that in a different way. So, okay, then I got this chair, and then, of course, I had to define that question. What is esotericism? How to define it? So on. Now, first, I wanted to, the chair was called History of Hermetic Philosophy. I mean, the woman who had made this money available was very much focused on, fascinated by the Hermetic movement. So I wrote a book about a 15th century Hermetic philosopher from the Renaissance, Lodovico Lazzarelli, whom nobody knew, and who really changed my whole perspective on the Hermetic literature. So that was an important book for me. So I wrote a book about the New Age, 20th century, and then a book about the 15th century, Hermetic philosopher with Latin on the left side and English translations on the right. Completely different kind of book. So these are the two poles, so to speak, esotericism and Hermeticism, that I've always been working on. But okay, then, well, we started building up this program. So we published a large collective volume, the Dictionary of Gnosis and Western Esotericism, 2005, to basically map the whole field and say, this is what it's all about. It's a huge book. It's 120 authors and very large. So we try to map the whole field. By 2012, I published the second book, or a second large book. And this is called Esotericism and the Academy, Rejected Knowledge in Western Culture. Mm-hmm. That is where I really try to answer the question you just posed. What is esotericism all about? Because I have been thinking about this for many years. And it's very difficult to define, actually. Now, the leading scholar in the field at that moment was Antoine Fèvre, a French scholar at the Sorbonne in Paris, who has become a very good friend of mine. He died last year in December, but we've been working together for decades. And he had a very specific definition of esotericism, which made quite a lot of impression on many people, has made school. But I developed my doubts about that approach. And so in this book of 2012, I basically have a long argument to explain what esotericism is all about in my field, and what it comes down to. I mean, it's difficult to summarize it in a few words, but I'll do my best. Basically, what I'm saying there is that there is a whole series of traditions from antiquity to the present. You have all kinds of forms of Platonism. You have Hermetic literature. You have astrology. You have alchemy. You have magical movements. You could move into the Renaissance period, early modernity. You have a revival of Hermeticism and Platonism. You get things like Christian theosophy, linked to a German genius, Jacob Böhme. You have the Rosicrucian movements, which come from the same traditions. You move into the 18th century. You have people like Emanuel Swedenborg, a kind of visionary who falls in the same tradition. You have mesmeric movements in the 19th century, which are all about trance induction. They have all kinds of occultist movements in the 19th and the 20th century. You have theosophy. You have guys like Aleister Crowley and other forms of occultist magic, and so on and so forth. And it leads all up to our own time. You get the New Age movement, etc. So all this kind of stuff, all these movements, and it's so complex and it is so diverse that it's hard to just define it in a few words. Now, the conclusion that I drew was that basically what defines esotericism is not so much its content or its content, but rather the fact that all of this stuff has been excluded, marginalized, and rejected by mainstream society. That is really what defines it. So I don't define it directly, but indirectly. And I give a long history, beginning in antiquity and especially in the Renaissance, of which shows that, well, you have mainstream traditions in Western culture like monotheism, of course, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, monotheism. You have standard philosophy, rational philosophy. You have rational science, and so on and so forth. But these traditions, there's one domain that they have always had problems with, and that is, for lack of a better word, paganism, pagan traditions from antiquity on. And paganism is, of course, a pejorative term. I use it in a neutral term, in a neutral sense. But basically, all this stuff that has been perceived by mainstream traditions as pagan, as irrational, as superstition, and so on and so forth, has been, so to speak, put into a kind of a wastebasket category. Like, this is the stuff that we do not take seriously. This is the stuff that we reject, that we marginalize, that does not fit our, ideas about truth and reality. And so what I've tried to sketch in the book is a long process of how, as modern science and modern Protestantism as well, develops from the 16th to the 17th, 18th century, and it all culminates in the Enlightenment periods, the Age of Reason, basically you get a kind of, let's say, an enlightenment worldview that defines its own identity by saying, I am not occult, I'm not mystical, I'm not this and not that. So, so the age of reason, the age of the Enlightenment ideology, so to speak, defines itself also indirectly against all this stuff that we now call esoteric. So, and in order to, to define their own identity, they had to create this kind of, what I call a kind of a dustbin or a wastebasket category of otherness, of everything that we are not supposed to take seriously. And of course, then with the building up of the modern academy, etc., all this stuff does get sidelined and does get marginalized. And through the 19th and 20th century, this is the kind of stuff that academics don't study anymore. We are not supposed to study it. We're not supposed to take it seriously because it's all nonsense, because it's all irrational superstition. And if you're a serious academic, you don't study it. That is basically the idea. And that whole category is what we now refer to as esotericism. So basically the wastebasket category of rejected knowledge. And so that's the subtitle of my book, Rejected Knowledge in Western Culture. So that's esotericism for me. And you can see it in many ways. For instance, let's give one example, alchemy, right? There is this standard narrative, an enlightenment narrative, which says that you have chemistry, that's science, and alchemy is superstition, right? And so, of course, chemistry defines itself against alchemy. But then this leads to problems, because then you look at someone like Isaac Newton, just the most famous example, of course, an icon of real science. And then you find out that Newton has written more words about alchemy in his life than about physics and optics. He has been fascinated by alchemy. And historians of science have been embarrassed by that, been embarrassed up to the present almost. They felt that, this must mean that Newton must have been crazy, or how would such a great scientist be involved in alchemy? And so this fits the kind of idea that this is nonsense, this is rejected knowledge against real science. Well, but if you actually look at the history of alchemy, and this is well known among specialists nowadays, you have people like Lawrence Principe and Bill Newman and many other scholars now, who show very clearly that alchemy, or what we now see as alchemy, was a normal part of science in the 17th century. This was not an other field. This wasn't rejected. It was part of normal science. So it's perfectly understandable that someone like Isaac Newton was studying it. So what this means, and this is one example, is that we actually have, what we have to do is rewrite our narratives, our stories about Western culture, and reintegrating this rejected knowledge into the mainstream story. This hasn't been the non-scientific other. It has been part of mainstream culture in many, many ways. And alchemy is one example, but you can give countless other examples. So the study of esotericism, the way I understand it, the way I see it, the way I promote it, is not about this kind of niche topic of alternative movements that stand on their own, so to speak. Now, what I actually want is something more ambitious. I think that the entire history of Western culture, and the term Western is contested nowadays, but I won't go there for the moment. But the whole history of Western culture, where we come from antiquity to the present, has been written in a very one-sided manner by excluding large parts of our common heritage from the picture. So what I think needs to be done is reintegrate all this stuff into our normal stories, into our narratives. And if you do that, then you find that so many things that we took for granted turn out to be very different from how we always thought they were. Mm-hmm. For instance, alchemy is a normal part of science that is counterintuitive to many people, but it is true. I mentioned Emanuel Swedenborg is another nice example. 18th century visionary. Most people think, in the wake of Immanuel Kant, most people think that Swedenborg was some kind of crazy visionary who had strange ideas and was, of course, totally unscientific. If you actually study Swedenborg, then you find out that he was an extremely well-respected scientist who had studied physics, biology, human anatomy, and many other scientific fields. And his worldview is part of his scientific worldview. It doesn't stand against it. It's not anti-scientific. It's part of the Enlightenment story, and so on and so forth. So you basically start to rethink the whole history of how we are used to looking at mainstream culture.
Well, and there's something about the esoteric that we're having this differentiation between what one can know propositionally. So consensus reality, that which can be measured, can be looked at, can be viewed with the senses, and a different kind of knowing that happens on a more, we could say, interior level, that's not going to be validated externally by anybody else, but can be shared by people who've had the experience. And so there does seem to be something about the esoteric that is hidden. And would it be safe to say that as soon as you add more than some amount of people, too many cooks in the kitchen starts, human beings being overly human beings, and then the ability to maintain that kind of singularity of experiential consciousness becomes fragmented just because of the nature of the human being looking outside of oneself always to adapt to an external environment. And so if you pack too many people in there, the capacity to maintain that singular interior experience becomes muddied. And so we're talking about systems of religious thought and experience that had to be protected on some level because the people outside of that tradition were going to disrupt or question or just mess it up, right? Is that fair to say that the esoteric is that which is hidden or needed to be hidden?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question. It's often said, it's one of the standard ideas about the esoteric. I've always pushed back a little bit against this because I know too many examples of stuff that we consider belonging to esotericism, which wouldn't really fit that picture.
Yeah.
So I'm not entirely sure. There are also questions like, what do you do with mysticism? Is mysticism the same as esotericism then or not? So you have these categories, and what do they mean? So that hasn't been my main focus, but you are right that the appeal to this kind of direct experiences that go beyond propositional language, etc., is central to many forms of esotericism. There's no doubt about that. And I think that goes back already to Plato, to Platonism itself. And so, it's an important part of it.
Is there some relationship between the amount of people that could be practicing together and the diminishing returns on what can be experienced? Have you seen that?
Can you explain that a bit more? How do you mean?
Well, I just don't imagine, for example, if we talk about the Hermetic spirituality, I don't imagine that you can have a lot of people doing that simultaneously.
Right. No, I do think that ultimately, the experience, let me think about it. The experience is ultimately an individual experience. Mm-hmm. What you find in the Hermetic literature is small groups, very small groups. And in the texts, it's usually two people. You have a teacher and you have a pupil. The teacher is usually Hermes Trismegistus, and the pupil is Tot, usually. And there is one particular text that I talk about a lot in my book, in which they, together have a kind of an direct experience of the ultimate, of the ultimate light, the undivided light of divinity, the nous. And what's very interesting is that in that experience, their consciousness seems to have merged in a certain way so that they experience the same thing together. And so what one of them sees, the other sees as well. And it's no longer so easy to actually differentiate their consciousness. So and that is so there seems to be this idea that ultimately when your consciousness gains access to the ultimate divine light, which is again called the nous, the ultimate divinity, almost ultimate, then actually there's no differentiation anymore between the observer and what is being observed. And also if two people observe the same reality, their consciousness actually turns out to be one of the same consciousness. And this has to do with, and this is an important part of my argument actually, about dualism and non-duality, because because the argument is that, and this again goes back to this narrative, this narrative, this picture of the soul that descends into the material realm. So in Pythagorean and Platonic terms, it's non-dimensional to begin with. So the soul doesn't have dimensions, but then it starts to move downward, and it is drawn out, so to speak, and it gains one dimension, like a line. And then it gets deeper into matter, and it becomes 2 and 3 dimensional. And finally, by the time it enters the body, it's living in a 3-dimensional body. But it means that the original consciousness of the soul is non-dual, because there is no duality. There is not even a protracted line. There's just a non-dimensional point, and so that's the original state of perfect knowledge. It's perfect non-dual consciousness, which also means very radically that there's not even a distinction between the knower and what is known. So, and there is a very impressive passage at the beginning of the Corpus Hermeticum, the Poimandres, where the pupil, Hermes, is looking into the eyes of the nous itself, of Poimandres, who is the ultimate the divinity. And this is a kind of, for me, I find this a kind of dazzling moment, because that is the moment when the visionary understands that I am here, I'm looking at the universal light, but there's no difference between the light that I am and the light that is being observed. So actually, you're looking into your own eyes. There is, so the distinction of observer and observed, of subject and object collapses, and there's only unity. There's only oneness, so non-duality. And I think this is fundamental to the Hermetic literature, because ultimate gnosis is non-dual. There's only light. There's nothing else. And but as consciousness gets embodied into matter, it gets divided into dualistic consciousness, because that is what we need in order to function and to survive. We cannot function otherwise in matter. It is not dual. It is dual and dualistic. But in order to find a way back again, you finally move from duality back to non-duality.
Well, and anybody who hasn't had this experience, it would seem crazy.
Yeah, it is very, very radical, and it is. And what I have to say, there has been so much scholarship about this, and I have great respect for my predecessors. I mean, people like André-Jean Festugière, the great French scholar who wrote large books about it, dominated the field, and so on. But what you can see is that only in very more recent scholarship, you see an increasing emphasis on the experiential aspect of this. This has been sidelined for a long time, but it's actually central. Well, that is what I've been saying all along, from the beginning.
Yeah, because that's when we get into questions like, just to punctuate this for a second, did that really happen? Is that real? Right? Yeah. Those questions, when somebody has an overwhelming experience where they merge with these kinds of realities, then to come back and to have all these faculties of being a human come online, questions such as, that's not real, that was just made up, that's just a function of how my body behaves under trauma, or I took a substance and it was that substance that affected my neurochemistry, that affected the way I perceive. And all of a sudden, the nature of our existence, of our human existence, wants to hide that experience. That's what's so interesting about seeing this playing out on a social level, is that thing that we do on an individual level when we are confronted with these altered states of experience is naturally to try to say, I don't understand that. And so much of this practice is not necessarily about how to experience that, but how to come back and how to be in this experience once one has experienced that experience. So I think something, if we can dive into your book, is that okay if we go back into
sure.
it?
Maybe just one thing about this. It's, I mean, very basically, I think what the Hermetica are really saying is that, the question of, is this real or is this not real, right? The question is, no, none of it is real. Nothing that we experience right now is real in an ultimate sense. None of it is real. The only thing that is absolutely real is the universal light of the nous. That is the only reality. And it's the only true reality. So the Greek word ta onta, ta onta, the things that really are, that is what you want to know. And it is completely, utterly different from anything that we experience in this world. And so their answer would be very straight. They would say, no, we are living in a state of, illusion, hallucination, like a dream. But the question is, and before we go on, into the book, but that's another point I'd like to emphasize because it's crucial to the book. Is this has to do with embodiment, and it's really important. So, let me put it this way: this is a major point of my argument, and I think it's important to just point it out a little bit. Is this? So we have this famous notion, the cave of Plato, right? Everybody knows the analogy. We are living in, it's like we're living in a cave. We are seeing shadows on the wall, illusions. They are not real. And in order to know reality, we have to leave the cave behind and see the sunlight and the real world outside, right? So that's the famous Platonic cave. And the message is that this is what we should do. We should leave illusion behind. We should leave this material world behind, leave the cave, and go into the sunlight of the ultimate, spiritual reality of the world of the ideas and so on. So this is a story of escape. A story of escaping from the cave, escaping from matter, escaping from the body, and so on and so forth. Now, very interestingly, and I think crucially, that is not what the Hermetic authors are saying. They're saying the opposite. They are not Gnostics. So you have the famous Gnostic story, like we are like sparks of light, sparks of spiritual light that are trapped in a material body and in a material world, and we have to escape from the prison of the world back to unity, back to the spiritual, right? That's the Gnostic story. That's not what the Hermetic are saying. They're actually saying something very different. And for me, this is key. And I explain this, the best way to explain this is with reference again to Plato. So the story of the cave is one story, but there's another side of Plato, which I think is more important ultimately for the Hermetica, which you find in the famous dialogue, the Symposium, where Socrates is talking with Diotima, and Diotima is the priestess of the mysteries. She's not a philosopher. She is a visionary who has direct access, direct gnosis, and she's teaching him what philosophy is all about. And Socrates is very clear in the Symposium. She was the one who pointed out what it was all about. So he gets the clue, not from a philosopher, but from a visionary, a female visionary. And that's important too.
I want to circle back to that.
Yeah. And but what does he say? there is this wonderful short exchange at one point where Diotima tells Socrates, Socrates, love is not really the desire for beauty as you think. Now, what this means is that according to the Platonic cave analogy, we desire the beauty of the spiritual world. That is what that's what we love. That is what we are looking for. That's what we're wishing and hoping for. And so we do not have that beauty here, but that is what's waiting for us outside the cave, right? And so all our erotic, our eros, all our striving, all our desires are for the ultimate beauty outside. And so it's all about the desire for beauty. And then, so the desire for finding a beauty that you don't find in the body and in the world. Now, Diotima says, no, Socrates, love is not the desire for beauty. And then Socrates answers, well, what is it then? And she says, it is giving birth in beauty. And of course, Socrates doesn't have a clue what she means by it. So he said, so, well, I'm sure you're right, he says. And she answers, of course I'm right, she says. So that's a little funny, like you dumbo. I mean, you have no idea what I'm talking about. I'm going to explain it to you. Now, and this is important. Why is it important? What she is saying is that we have this notion of escaping from the cave and finding our way back to ultimate beauty, goodness, and truth, the ultimate spiritual reality. And she says, no, that is not what it's all about. It's not about escape. What it's all about is that you have to connect with the goodness and the beauty and the truth of the ultimate spiritual world. You have to make a connection, certainly. But once you've made a connection, you have to embody it in the world. You have to actually make sure, you have to bring it down.
Yeah.
It's not about escaping. It's actually bringing the goodness, beauty, and truth into the world, embodying it, giving birth to it. And I find it's, there is something, in terms of gender, it's an interesting story. There is a stereotypical male perspective, right? So the cowboy who rides out into the sunlight, So this guy who just leaves the cave and he rides into the sunlight of the spiritual reality. That's a very masculine perspective, right? And then you have Diotima, a woman who talks actually about giving birth in the cave.
Yeah.
That's what she says. It's about giving birth in the cave. And that's a female perspective. It's about drawing down, bringing down goodness, beauty, and truth into the world in order to perfect, to improve and perfect the world. So the interesting, fascinating thing about Hermetica for me is that this is not a story of escape. It's not Gnostic in that sense. This is a story about what they were doing is, they said the whole goal is to connect with the source, the ultimate source, and then to connect with the real source of beauty, goodness, and truth, and then making sure that you bring it into the world so that the world becomes a better place. So you must try to become better people, try to, the whole, nature as a whole, the whole world as a whole is not a prison. It's not something bad. It is a beautiful expression of the endless fertility of God himself, who just expands himself into this fantastic, dazzling, material world of sounds and colors and smells and everything, things you can touch. All of that is good. So the essence of the Hermetic gods is not just some kind of bleak otherworldly reality. No, it is a source of fertility, of abundance, of creativity. And so the goal for the Hermetica is to actually assist the divine source in creating and in making a beautiful world. And so you see also the kind of priestly ethics that's behind this. So there's a wonderful passage in the Asclepius and Hermetic text, which says that human beings should think about themselves like they have a kind of priestly duty. Our task is to take care of the world, and then to make sure that we treat the world the way it deserves to be treated, to make it as beautiful and as great and as fantastic as possible, because that is what the divine source wants. It doesn't want us to escape to another world. It wants us to make the world a better place, to quote Michael Jackson, right? So, now, I mean, it sounds a bit corny, maybe to say it like that, but that's really what it's all about. So it's a very world-affirming, positive, embodied perspective, and this I think is essential to understanding.
Well, I want to note something really quickly that just occurred to me, that because I was thinking, why is Michael Jackson's quote kind of, why does, well,
exactly. Yeah.
There inherently there's a suspiciousness, I think, of a lot of people. Like, we're set up in a reward-based system. So if I want to do good and bring beauty into the world, it's because I'm selfishly trying to get mine. I'm getting something in return. The paradigm that you're talking about is one of expression of the real in this embodied state, because one has been touched by ultimate beauty, not because there's an attempt to incarnate it, because I feel like I'm a tarnished being and I've got to bring something beautiful into the world. It's such a radically different theological set that certainly psychologically sets us up without a conflict. There's not like the inner knowing of like, you're kind of full of shit and you're just trying to get some reward. There's this real positive connection with something beyond what is comprehensible that's seeking to express itself in an embodied state. And that, to me, that makes total psychological, sociological, philosophical, and theological sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can only agree. This is, and I mean, it's really, and what you can see is, maybe as one footnote to this, since you've read the book, you know what I'm talking about. Modern scholars in the 20th century, up till late into the previous century, have kept putting Gnostic and Christian world-denying, pictures on the Hermetica. They've just kept misunderstanding it. It's one example. There's a famous part of the Corpus Hermeticum 1, the first treatise of the Corpus Hermeticum, most important, series of texts, the Poimandres. And there it describes how the world came into existence and how human beings came into existence and so on. And there is this moment when out of the ultimate universal light of the Godhead, of the nous, there emerges this child of God, or who is the universal man, the anthropos, the great human. A great human who is an ultimate, extremely beautiful and wonderful and perfect. This and everybody immediately, I mean, God himself falls in love with him, so to speak. So he is. So he's this beautiful human. I say human, not man. It's often been called man, but it's actually an androgynous being. But then he starts behaving. Yeah, okay, it's complicated. The gender aspects are complicated. But then at one point, so the story says that and then the great human bowed down through the firmament, and it looked down on nature, and nature was down below. That's the material world, the world of nature. And she's female and he is male. He's now gendered male in that situation, in spite of being androgynous as well. It's complicated, but let's think of him as the grand man. And nature is female and it's down there. He sees her, he falls in love with her, and she smiles back to him, and she falls in love with him. And so he comes down and they start making love. So it's and out of that comes the whole rest of realization of human beings and so on. So that's the great moment when the spiritual meets and marries the material. And it's a wonderful love story. Now, amazingly, if you read the scholarship, early 20th century, Reitzenstein and others, great scholars, they see this story, and what they see is not a love story. What they see is a story of seduction, of entrapment. they immediately make matter into something sinister, something
Mm.
dark.
Mm-hmm.
It's feminine and it's dark and dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like a pre-Raphaelite painting. These paintings end 19th century of this sinister, demonic feminine, this demonized women who are drawing down men into matter and into sin and to sexuality and all that. All of that is bad. This is a very misogynic, very kind of perspective, and it's amazing. If you read the scholarship about this text, almost all scholars fell for that immediately. So they saw this as a story of entrapment, the fall of man into matter, seduction of the pure masculine by the feminine demonic counterpart that draws him down into sin, into matter, and all that by sexual attraction, and so on. And this has been the dominant narrative, and it's completely wrong. Nothing like that is to be found in the text. What you find is actually a positive story of the wonderful marriage between spirit and matter. And the reason I highlight is this: we have such a strong legacy in our culture of anti-body, anti-matter kind of thinking. Of course, anti-sexuality is called sex draws you down into the matter, all those kind of things. And it's very misogynic and all that. And it's fascinating. If you read the Hermetic literature, this text, it doesn't say any of those things. It says exactly the opposite. It's about the beautiful marriage of, by means of sexual union between matter and spirit. And it's completely positive. So this is one example how, in my view, one of the most important Hermetic texts has been completely misinterpreted for generation and generations because of our anti-body prejudice.
Well, it's a point that I think is warranted. I'm in a process of learning Greek right now, and I maybe read like a 4-year-old, but I could read the Greek. I could make some of it out. There are elements of this academic tradition that takes a certain labor to really get into the text, and how many people don't do that?
No.
And so there was a real sense of the problems of not only misinterpretation, but mistranslation of you have those two layers, and you really tended to that a lot, because we're talking about a text that has fragments that have been rediscovered and rewritten, and who knows who was doing what and when and how, and these concepts even that, when I say nous and we define it in the way that we do, it's possible that somebody has a vastly different imaginative association to that word, that external word, than I would today. I have to labor to get that.
Yeah. No, and the point of translation is crucial to my whole argument, because translation comes from a Latin word, transferre, which literally means, putting across. Like you have a river and you put it from one side of the river, you put it on the other side. So transferre. So you have to cross some boundaries, some kind of liminal space in between. And that is what transferre, translation, translatus comes from transferre. It means crossing a liminal space. So you have something said in one language, let's say ancient Greek, and then you translate it into English, and you think you're translating it straight, but something gets lost in translation because you have to cross that liminal space. And and it is very, very difficult not to project your own, let's say, English presuppositions and prejudices back onto the Greek and see something there that isn't there. And this is, I think this is a key issue, and it happens all the time. So we keep translating, and of course, I'm hoping that I'm making a bit of progress here. But what can I say? I mean, it's very difficult, and I might have fallen prey to some mistranslations myself. It's always possible.
Sure,
it's very difficult.
Oh, yeah. Although if you have the experience, there's no issue with translation. That's what's so unique. If you can have and maintain, you and I can then share an understanding where we might have differences in our experience, and we would note that. That's okay. Of course, we have differences in our experience. But when you know, and that's this language we hear of the initiate, that eyes to see, ears to hear, the eyes of the heart, as you said, are the ears of heart. So you said something
exactly
earlier.
what I say. I mean, just the way you said it just now was exactly right. So when you have this direct experience, then you don't need translation. Yeah, that's, I think, what I heard you say.
Yeah.
That's exactly it. So we are on this side of the river in our embodied world in which we are conversing by Zoom and so forth.
It's crazy shit.
And then there is the direct non-dual experience of gnosis, which is on the other side of the river. And once you're there, no translation is necessary. That's exactly. I mean, there's no need to translate because you're there. And that's the whole point. The problems occur in a moment when you have to put something that's untranslatable into language, and it cannot be wholly done. It's because it can never take the place of the direct experience.
Well, it's when, I love that, the William James dyad here, the knowledge of about and knowledge of acquaintance, that my intellectual desire seeks to know about something. So I constantly have this part of me as a human being that's wanting to adapt and to soak and to understand and to have some way of identifying this as that and that is this and that's not that. And it's working consistently throughout my consciousness.
That's dualistic.
Dualistic thinking, and that other thing, when we cross the river, we might just embrace each other as brothers and cry a little bit. And we don't give a shit what you call it,
No, that's right. No, it is something like that. And I mean, and it is not actually so unusual as people think. People think, oh, there's this weird, very strange mystical experience or something like that. It's not even that. It also goes for any kind of knowledge by acquaintance. At the beginning, I said, knowing the person, knowing somebody personally, that cannot be translated into words either. It's very common. We all know it. We all constantly have cases where we know things that we cannot translate. There's nothing strange about it. This isn't even mystical. It is just the fact that some things that you cannot translate.
And that's the real essence. It's like I was telling my son yesterday, I said, look, man, magic is not what we think it is. Magic is here. It's right here. And the nature of my consciousness means that I'm going to have all that residue that accumulates that prevents me from being able to recognize the magic of this lived experience, and how amazing it is to be a fragment of that universal light that's embodied in a human experience, and getting to taste.
Now you're sounding really like an Hermetic practitioner. That's what they say. Yeah.
Well, I felt very much at home in your text, man. I gotta say, what because I saw myself in this text, and I thought, well, those are the words. Like that's putting to words. If we could say, it's bringing into this existence, into dual existence, what an experiential aspect of knowing. I mean, I know, and then to struggle with it, and to how do you say this? Like, how do you communicate God? Like that word does not do it, and I struggle with it's the all that is all and no thing in simultaneous non-temporal exist. Like you start going into some
words. Yeah. No, but that's the whole thing. So when the pupil taught in one of the most important texts, the Octawat and the Amiat, the pupil taught with Hermes finally gets there, right? So he has the experience, and the very first thing he says is, "It is impossible to put this in words." That's the very first statement he makes. And then and I see then people say, yeah, sure, of course, I cannot express the words, but it has to be taken seriously. This is the most fundamental statement that he makes. It cannot be expressed in words.
And
It can't.
fucking frustrating.
It is.
It's so frustrating.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So going back for a moment, because here we are on like page 6 of your book that I'm about to say this.
Yeah.
But so one of the first really interesting parts of your book, because again, I really appreciate this text. One of the things that you talked about was this: you were setting up this journey from into Egypt, or into the tip of Egypt in Alexandria, and talking about the priestly class. And the way you portrayed it was that the priest, if we could call this person that, the priest, was setting up a situation for the initiate, or this individual, to have an experience. And it wasn't believed to be false. It, like he's using a light source and on the water, and all of a sudden the initiate's talking to Asclepius, and nobody's going to say, "Ah, man, you're fucking around. Like you're just playing jokes," because that's the whole point. And would you start with this? Because
so I have a chapter in which I introduce the reader to Egypt, and one aspect here is important, is that there is this kind of general assumption that all of this was centered in Alexandria, right? Right in the north, Alexandria, the great Hellenistic city where Greek was the common language and so on, and where Egyptians were actually minority, interestingly enough. There were less Egyptians there than people from other countries, from other backgrounds. And so that is the assumption. But I'm arguing, and I'm not the only one, I'm really standing on the shoulders of other people like Christian Bull, who has written a wonderful dissertation a couple of years ago about these topics. No, actually, if you then go down the Nile or up the Nile, you go north, go south. You go to Upper Egypt. Upper Egypt is south, and so it's the other way around. Then actually, I think there's much reason to assume that the center of the Hermetic spirituality was not in Alexandria, but it was more down south, in areas that were less heavily influenced by Greek and more Egyptian. And so you have this, these priestly traditions, and the situation was that the Roman conquerors, the Roman occupiers, did not like Egyptian religion. They had contempt for religious practices of the Egyptians, and so what you see is that the priestly class is withdrawing. They are, the temples are falling into disrepair, and they feel isolated and not respected in a way that their religion would deserve. And so in this context, it looks like certain priests, in this priestly context, there must have been groups that came together to do practices, to practice this kind of spiritual path. So Christian Bull in this book has emphasized the importance of priests, to the Hermetic spirituality, and I think this is very convincing. Now, what I'm doing is I'm also I'm strongly connecting this Hermetic spirituality with a practice that's known as theurgy, and I think that's an important term here. Theurgy is usually associated with the Neoplatonists, especially with Iamblichus. So you have Plotinus, the founder of Neoplatonism. You have Porphyry, who has edited the works of Plotinus, and then you have Iamblichus, or Iamblichus, who came from Syria, and in my firm opinion, has studied and practiced in Alexandria, so he knew Egypt, and who developed an understanding of Platonism that was different from Plotinus and Porphyry. And the difference was precisely the emphasis on embodiment. Well, there you go again. So embodiment. So this was not a disembodied, but an embodied Platonism. And what Iamblichus was saying, and I think this is very, very close to what you find in the Hermetic literature, is that, this I have to explain again a little bit. the standard kind of Neoplatonic idea that you find in Plotinus and Porphyry and so on is that the human soul descends into the body, but a part of the soul remains in the spiritual world up there. So there's this kind of umbilical cord, so to speak, that keeps connecting us with the higher world, and therefore, according to Plotinus and Porphyry, by means of philosophy, it is possible to reconnect with the spiritual part of our soul, which is up there, and so and that is what philosophy is all about. So this idea that the soul does not fully descend. Now, Iamblichus was different, and I think in this respect, I think this is the pattern that you find in the Hermetica as well. He was saying, very shockingly for his predecessors, that the soul is completely embodied. So there's nothing of our soul that is left behind, that stays in the upper world. Our entire soul plunges, so to speak, into matter and into the body, and nothing is left behind. In my book, I use the analogy of, it's like bungee jumping without a rope, right? So you there's no rope, so you bungee jump, and there you are. Yeah, bungee jumping without a rope, like you. So the soul gets lost in matter, and for someone like Porphyry, that's Iamblichus was in contact, in correspondence with, this would be a horrible idea. So the soul gets lost in matter, and there's no way it can save itself, right? Because there's no connection left to the upper world. And Iamblichus said no. He had a very different perspective. He said, yes, it's true that philosophy cannot get us there. We have no connection left. We are completely lost in matter, yes. And because that's the case, the gods have to come to our aid. They have to help us. They have to save us. And you cannot do that. So you cannot reach the gods through philosophy. But what you can do is you organize rituals, ceremonies which are done in such a way that you create conditions for the gods to appear. Mm-hmm. And so the conditions have to be right. The right ceremonial context, the right words must be said, the right kind of smells or incense and all kind of stuff must be there. If you do it right, if you do the rituals right, then the gods will appear and they will come to our aid. So instead of doing it ourselves by reaching back to our soul up there in the spiritual world, it's the other way around. The gods come down and they help us, and they heal us. So it's about healing. It's about healing the soul. And this was a radical perspective. So this has nothing to do anymore with the Platonic cave, right? Mm-hmm. And this is really something. This is really the embodied perspective of Diotima. So Iamblichus has his perspective that you do rituals. This was called theurgy. Theurgy means literally the work of the gods. So gods at work, as one of my sections is called. So you do rituals, you do the ceremonies, and then the gods come down, they appear, and they start helping you, and they start healing you and cleaning you from bodily accretions and from the poisons that have taken possession of our body and those kind of things. They even allow the soul to temporarily leave the body on a kind of vacation trip to the spiritual world. And then while the soul has left the body, the physical body, is cleaned by the gods of all kind of accumulated negative stuff. It's cleaned, and so the soul returns, and then it finds its house cleaned. And then there are things you can do in order to keep your body pure, and so on and so forth. Mm. And so this was a kind of a very embodied ritual ceremonial practice, theurgy. And for Iamblichus, that is what really what it was all about. Now he refers explicitly to the Hermetic literature, and I take that very seriously. I think that he had direct experience in Egypt with Hermetic practitioners. I see him as a practitioner of the Hermetic path of Hermes. He was in connection with probably with priests there in Alexandria who were doing this. So his book that's known as De Mysteriis, the book on the mysteries of the Egyptians, a kind of classic text, contains a lot of discussion that I think is directly relevant for understanding the Hermetic literature. So yeah, so what these people were doing. So you're in let's say in a temple sanctuary, might also be other places. It could also be at somebody's home, but let's say a temple sanctuary. And then you have to do the right things in order to make sure that the gods will come down. You're not attracting the gods, you're not invoking them. The gods come out of their own accords, out of their free will. But they will do it when you create the right conditions, because the gods are good and they are very willing to help you. So if you do it right, they will not fail to appear. Right. So, and this is the other important point. Because Porphyry thinks that Jamblichus is advocating some kind of magic, drawing down the gods, forcing them to appear, those kind of things, like magic. Mm-hmm. And Jamblichus says, no, that's not what it's all about. The gods come out of their own will. I'm not forcing them. I'm not commanding them. And nobody can. They're totally superior to us. They come out of their own volition because they're good. And they are out there to help us if we welcome them. So that's, so I think theurgy is an important, context to keep in mind if you read the Hermetic literature.
How much substance, how much are drugs used in these?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I have some discussions of that. There's very, very little, direct evidence. In Iamblichus, in De Mysteriis, there's one passage which twice refers to something like potions, but we do not know what it is. We simply don't know. I find it likely that maybe there was something that they ingested, but we have not a clue what it may have been. We simply don't know. And I don't like to speculate about things I don't know. That's one thing. There's another thing that is the use of incense, especially so-called Kufi incense, which was well known and which was used all over Egypt. And there is reason to assume that Kufi incense had mild narcotic properties. There's description by Plutarch, for instance, who says that the influence of Kufi brightens the soul like a mirror, like it does something. Somehow it empowers the soul. And it's interesting here. I mean, we think of entheogens or as psychoactive substances, like, so you take this substance and then it has an effect on your mind. I think we should consider the possibility that these people were not thinking about it like that at all. What you were doing is simply you are doing a ritual. If you want to do it right, if you want the gods to appear, a number of conditions must be right. One of them is there must be incense. And incense is Kufi. So you burn the incense. I'm not sure whether they thought, okay, now I see the gods because I've inhaled incense, the Kufi incense. I think rather that you burn the incense. If you don't burn the incense, then the gods will not appear. Then the gods do appear, not because you are under the influence of an hallucinogen, but because the gods appear because you've done the ritual right, including burning the incense. So the burning the incense is something that needs to be done. And of course, people did breathe it in, and of course it did have an effect on the mind. But I'm not so sure whether they actually saw this as a causal connection. Anyway, so Kufi was there. So this must be one part of the puzzle. Iamblichus speaks about potions. We do not know what it is. In the Hermetic literature, there's not a single reference to anything that could suggest psychoactive substances. Nothing. So that is, we simply don't know. The one other text that I refer to, and I think you had that in mind when you asked the question, is a text from the Greek magical papyri that I talk about a little bit, the so-called Mithras liturgy, which basically, to use modern terminology, could be seen as a kind of a trip report. I mean, it is really a trip. So the practitioner is a woman. and she does ritual invocations, prayers, and so on. At one point, she is lifted up into the air. She sees the planets glowing at her as if they're going to attack her, like it's very, strange experience. Then she moves on further. At one point, she gets closer to the sun. Then the sun opens up, and out of the sun, I'm just cutting it short, comes the god of the sun, Helios Mitros, who comes out of the sun and answers our questions. Now, I'm to summarize it very quickly. So there are all kinds of strange events that are happening in this text. And what I find amazing, it's a famous text, discussed by many scholars. A lot of commentaries on it. There's a lot of scholarship on the Mitras liturgy. Almost nobody, including the most reliable, greatest specialist on this text, almost nobody mentions or does anything with the fact that 1/5 of the text is a recipe for an ointment. And they give the recipe, so they give the ingredients, and they give exact instructions what you have to do. It's 1/5 of the complete text is a recipe, and in the standard scholarship that I've seen, with very few exceptions, it is just ignored as if it isn't there. But I think it's key. What you see is clearly that this ointment has to be rubbed into the eyes, or around the eyes. Of course, the skin is thin there, so you can assume that it has to be absorbed by the skin. Then while you're doing this, that's what the text says, you have to invoke, to speak this long invocation. That takes time. And of course, it takes time for the ointment to have an effect. And then eventually, then the person will start feeling that she's lifted up into the air, and all these other things happen. I think for me, it's a no-brainer, really. This is very clear. You have a recipe. He says specifically, if you do this, you will be super amazed by the effects. And that's what it says literally. So you have description of an psychoactive substance that's rubbed into the eyes, and then you have a visionary experience, and you see a god, right? The only problem is that with the information we have, we cannot reproduce the ointment, because some crucial ingredients we cannot identify. Especially there's this plant called kentritis, and people have tried to identify the plant so far without a success, and it's a key ingredient, so we don't know. But the Egyptians who are reading the text no doubt knew what kentritis was. They knew where to find it, and they could make the ointment. So this is not a Hermetic text. This is a text from the Greek magical papyri, but it comes from the same culture, from the same period. So it's suggestive. So there you have direct hard evidence. You have the kufi, you have the ointments of Iamblichus, but you have nothing in the Hermetic text themselves. So this remains speculative.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing, it seems interesting that the way you started your book is that the Greeks are looking at the Egyptians and saying, what have they got, And on some level, we're looking at the Greeks and going, well, and then you've got people that no, not Greek, but Egyptian, and maybe not Egyptian, but the Byzantine. There's always some, I want to say better, but more pure, less obstructed view of this reality, and I wonder if we can continue our path along, because it seems like in these confluence points, you get something very powerful, that when the Egyptian and the Greek come together, there's something that erupts. Keep us going down this Hermetic process.
So what you're alluding to here is, again, by the way, this is why I call the book Hermetic Spirituality and the Historical Imagination. I didn't explain that yet, but maybe I can.
Yes.
Historical imagination. What I mean is that scholars are human beings like everybody else, and they imagine these things. They have their own ways of imagining the past, the historical imagination. And a lot of the interpretations of the Hermetica have been heavily influenced by an ideology, it should be called, that I refer to as Philhellenism or Hellenophilia, the love of all things Greek. Yeah, and I mean, I can totally understand the love of all things Greek. It's a fantastic, rich, fascinating culture. So there's nothing wrong with loving Greek culture. On the contrary, but Philhellenism is an ideology that you can trace through the 18th, through the 19th, and into the 20th century, which became dominant among scholars, among classics, and other people in this field, working in this field. And the idea was basically that, true superior civilization and Western civilization is based upon the Greeks. And the Greeks, so basically in ancient Greece, the light of reason and science began to shine and began to drive away the darkness of superstition and magic and all those kind of things. Where did the superstition and the magic come from? Egypt. Not just Egypt, it came from the Orient, from the East. So there's a lot of discussion nowadays about Orientalism, right? But you already see here this idea that Greek stuff, rational, scientific, good, right? And then its counterpart is the Orient. The Orient is irrational. It is threatening. It's dangerous. And Egypt is a key example of the East in this story. And I mean, this also this resonated with other kind of typical biblical stories. Like, of course, the people of Israel got liberated out of Egypt. You have this kind of opposition. Egypt is a land of darkness, of magic, idolatry, superstition, you name it. And then, of course, the positive counterparts, which is either the people of Israel that liberated out of it, and then you have Greece as the land of where the light of reason starts to shine. Well, you know, that kind of story has become so dominant because basically when modern scholars began studying the Hermetic literature, texts written in Egypt, but in the Greek language, so it's a combination of Egypt and Greece. So then the question is, okay, what is it? Is it Egyptian or is it Greek? And almost all scholars had this kind of knee-jerk reaction, like it must be Greek. We must claim it for Greece. And it cannot be too Egyptian because that makes it irrational and backwards and primitive and what have you. So you have this Philhellenist agenda. And the strongest example is the great French scholar, I mentioned him earlier, André Jean Vestigiaire, who wrote the fundamental work about Hermetica, the first part of the 20th century. And yeah, he had this dominant Philhellenist agenda. He wanted to prove that the Egyptian stuff was just marginal, not of any importance. It was everything important in the Hermetica was Greek. Therefore, it was not dependent on these dangerous Oriental influences. No, it was Greek. And anything, if it, simply because he has spent such a large part of his life studying this stuff, and you want to convince yourself that it's worthwhile, that it's valuable. It can only be valuable if it is rational and if it's philosophical, if it is Greek. And you see even more strongly, by the way, one of the most influential translations, large ultimately four volume translation by Walter Scott of the Hermetica, which is still being read a lot, is he came from the same perspective. And so Walter Scott was the kind of classicist who knows Greek by heart. He can play with it, he can read it like the newspaper. But he was reading the Hermetica, and he was basically cleaning up the text wherever he found irrational, backwards, magical, superstitious stuff. He just said this cannot be right, and he starts changing the text actually. So the whole Greek text gets cleaned up, so to speak, so as to ultimately turn it into some kind of neat, rational treatise that philosophers can take seriously. But in doing so, he completely falsified what the text was all about. And, this is what's been going on. So what you see after the Second World War, new generation of scholars like Frenchman Jean-Pierre Mahe and then later Garth Fowden, very important book, The Egyptian Hermes in the 80s. Yeah, they start turning it in the other direction and saying, no, actually, the Egyptian dimension of the Hermetica is essential, fundamental for understanding this. So they start to push back against this full Hellenist agenda and try to, redress the balance. So and also saying it's not just Greek philosophy. So there's the philosophy part again. It is they would call it religious, I would call it spiritual. So instead of Greek philosophy, it is Egyptian Hellenistic spirituality.
What translation do you like? Like if you're recommending to somebody who wants to study Hermetic spirituality, what's your go-to text aside from your own?
To be perfectly honest, I'm not satisfied with any of the English translations.
Yeah, that sucks.
And I am thinking of maybe working together with colleagues. Well, let's see, to try to work towards a new translation. Maybe I think, not that they are bad. I mean, you have the well-known translation by Brian Copenhaver, which is very reliable. I don't mean to say anything bad about it.
This one.
Problem, right. Yeah. I don't mean anything bad about it. It's very precise and very literal. But the problem is that it's so literal that sometimes it becomes unreadable because he just translates almost word for word. And, and sometimes so by translating Greek syntax into English syntax, and then you end up with very strange English sentences sentences that no English writer would write. Mm-hmm. Literally, it's correct almost always, but it doesn't result in very readable translations often. Mm-hmm. I think that's a problem. So if you're aware of that, then Copenhagen's book translation is certainly useful. You have also a guy called Salomon and a couple of other people who translated it into English, and I have similar reservations there. Mm-hmm. One thing that they do that I think is good is they don't translate nous as intellect or mind. They just nous. I think that's a step forward. So you keep it untranslated. It's a new word that we have to learn in our language. So nous as a new word. But if you ask me a translation, if you go beyond English, I think the old French translation by Vestigaire is very reliable, sometimes a bit because and you see kind of certain kind of Catholic kind of tendencies in the translation, but that's a good translation. There's also an excellent German translation by Jens Holzhausen, which is...
I'm totally locked out of these. I'm learning Greek. I can't learn German and French. That's such a problem.
Sorry about that.
But it's true. I'm an American who speaks decent English and the 6-year-old Spanish.
For your audience, maybe it's So some people might have German and French, and
I hope so. If you do,
and Vestigaire,
yeah, good. Those are good recommendations. And so the other piece, again, so many pieces, and if I take us too far afield here, you talk about maybe just let me throw this word out there. The word is patriarchy, and of course it brings up this split in gender. And you note Diotima is the kind of teacher, and it seems like it reminds me of this. I don't know, that masculine dimension of to define it, to touch it. Of course, it's human, but it's been very male oriented, and then you have this feminine approach. And I'm interviewing a fella named Edward Beaver coming up pretty soon on witchcraft.
Yeah, I know. Nice work. It's great.
And so wonderful. And so we're looking at this male terror of the feminine that's played out certainly in its religious orientation by talking about Eve being this, corrupter. And so the body and nature being something that needs to be dominated and staved off. And so would you speak a little bit about what you see, given your knowledge and your expertise, what you see in the relationship between religion and women and men, and the kind of slant of religion from a male perspective.
Right. Yeah, some parts I already mentioned. I think Diotima is a perfect model for the Hermetic teacher. I'm not saying that Diotima was a Hermetic teacher. I'm not saying that, but I think that she is a kind of a model of a model example of what a perfect Hermetic visionary would be, like direct knowledge. And it's not for nothing that that she fits so well. But so one point is that I think there's plenty of reason to assume that Hermetic practitioners could be male and female. I think this was not an all-male kind of community, even though the figures that appear in the text are male. So you have Hermes Trismegistus, you have Tot, his pupil, but you have also other people. You have, for instance, the alchemist Zosimos, who I think was another Hermetic practitioner. I talk about him at length. So he's the kind of foundational figure for alchemy in antiquity. And he was writing letters to his friend or pupil, Telesebea, who was a woman working in Panopolis. And he gives her advice, also spiritual advice, about how she can find gnosis and enlightenment. So I think Telesebea, I think of Telesebea as a female member of these kind of communities. And I think there's sufficient evidence to assume that men and women could be involved in the Hermetic communities. About, on a more metaphysical level, the ultimate divinity is androgynous. And maybe that's also something I should fill in. So the worldview is, there are 10 levels. And that's interesting. So you have the seven planets. So in the middle, you have to have the material world, our world in the center of the cosmos. They have the 7 planets that circle around the cosmos. This is obviously far before Copernicus and the heliocentric worldview. So you have the 7 planets circling the Earth. At 7, then the 8th sphere is beyond the fixed stars. That is the sphere of souls, the octawatt, or the 8th sphere. Beyond that is the 9th sphere, the ennead, which is the sphere of powers. And these are powers of light. This is spiritual light, and this is ultimately the same as the nous. So the ultimate, undivisible spiritual light of the nous. That's the 9th sphere, the ennead. And then you have beyond it, you have the source, perge in Greek, and so that's number 10 or 1, 1 to 10 or 10 to 1. But it depends how you want to count. And well, it's interesting that in terms of gender, this source is very interesting, the perge. It is completely impossible to say anything about it. So what Hermetic authors are saying is that our whole reality comes from a source that we absolutely do not understand. It's completely, utterly beyond our comprehension. We do not know what it is. We do not know what it is. All we know is that out of it comes an endless flow of energy, of creativity, and of light and creative power. But in itself, what it is, it's completely incomprehensible. So that's the source. So we cannot even say that it is male or female. It is beyond anything that we can imagine. But out of it comes the nous, the ennead, the 9th sphere, the sphere of light. And this one is very explicitly androgynous. It is self-generating, as it said, as the text says. So it is described as this entity that can fertilize itself and get fertilized by itself. It's male and female, and there is, sometimes some texts have very explicit sexual, language to talk about it. At one point in the Asclepius, it says that really it uses it talks about the fertile power of the nous in terms of very explicit sexual language, like the male and the female, emitting seed, and the female part receives the seed into her womb, and so on and so forth. And out of that everything is born. So they are not very prudish. They are very explicit about this. And so the androgyny is important. Also, so this grand human that is born out of the light is also an androgynous being. But then when he moves forwards, downwards, towards the material world, then it looks like at that point, gender differentiation begins to appear. So he begins to behave basically as masculine, even though technically he is androgynous. And nature also behaves as female, even though she comes from the same androgynous source. So it gets ambiguous there. So I think more or less you can say that if you move from the ultimate mystery of the source downward towards matter, you also see the movement from something that's beyond gender towards a level that is has both genders, male and female, towards a level where the two gets differentiated. And then, of course, ultimately, you end up with human beings and animals who are male, female, and you get the whole process of
and
sexual.
you get the whole process of why men in positions of power with a religious worldview that suggests that women and matter are somewhat evil and to be escaped from, yet this crazy, insatiable desire to merge sexually with the other in a heterosexual dynamic, that shit, that creates a lot of pretty messed up people that don't really know how to, or am I God or am I some power-hungry demon?
Or the power-hungry demons. We'll come to that. No, but the point is that in the Hermetic worldview, as I read it, this kind of anti-feminine kind of perspective isn't there.
Yeah.
Simply
wow.
That is it's simply there. I think it is really. I see no evidence whatsoever for a kind of superiority of men over women or something like that. And the best example is the story I told you about. So this making love between the grand human and nature. Yeah. It's a love story. It is not a fall into matter or anything like that.
Well, and I guess if anything, that is the real genuine approach here, is that how do we get to a time where there wasn't such a split and such a force of conflict? I mean, yes, of course, partnerships, whether it's male and male or female and female or male and female, partnerships are going to have conflict. Just because, back to what we were talking about earlier, the nature of consensus reality is that we're going to have an either or kind of dualistic dynamic, am I right or are you right? But if we, the concept that I do want to explore, which is like burning a ember of fire and oneness in my consciousness, is this phrase of becoming the ion. And, becoming the ion... The distinctions between male and female are I and thou even completely go away. So would you talk about that a little bit?
Becoming the ion. Yeah. All right. Yeah, that's a very important part of my book. That's true. That's Corpus Hermeticum 13. So the 13th treatise of the Corpus Hermeticum, one of the most important texts. It's about rebirth. And so just to summarize for your audience generally, briefly. So what you see there is it's a dialogue between Hermes Trismegistus, the teacher, and his pupil Tot. And it's a very interesting dialogue. It is very emotional and very personal. And what you see is that, Tot tells his master, listen, Hermes, I have been doing what you taught me. I have been training myself. I'm filling in here meditational techniques and whatever. I've done everything that I needed to do in order to receive gnosis, but I'm still not there. So please tell me what I should do, because I'm ready to receive gnosis. And then, so he really insists on this, and Hermes seems to be, he seems to hesitate. And he gives some vague answers that Tot doesn't understand. And Tot gets angry. He says, why don't you tell me straight how I can find gnosis? What should I do? Give it to me. And then Hermes says, well, it's not that I try to be vague, but I do not know what to tell you because something has to happen to you. Something has happened to me. And if this hasn't happened to you, you will not be able to understand what I'm telling you. You have to be reborn. And he says, this happened to me. I went out of myself into a new body. And I'm no longer the one I was before. And then he says, this mystery cannot be explained. This cannot be taught. I cannot teach you this. I cannot tell you what happens. You have the experience. So again, the emphasis on direct experience. I cannot possibly convey this to you if you haven't experienced it yourself. Okay, well then, Tot is very frustrated because because Hermes tells him, you are looking at me now, and you see my physical body, but that is not my real body. My real body, I have been reborn in a new body, and I'm not the person that you see in front of your eyes. Now, Tot gets frustrated and angry because he sees the physical Hermes that he has always known. He doesn't see this invisible body of Hermes, so clearly he doesn't have this ability that he should have. So, and then something interesting happens. You see that he begins shifting into an altered state of consciousness. And there is, the Greek word is mania, which is at the origin of our work, like manic and so on. Divine madness. Divine madness. So something is happening to his consciousness. He is shifting into a strange altered state of divine madness. And when Hermes notices that this is the case, he says, oh, maybe what happened to me, the rebirth, is now beginning to happen to you as well. So this is a hopeful sign. Okay, there are some other things going on, but then at one point, Tot thinks, well, now I am in an altered state. Now I should be able to see your invisible body, but actually he doesn't see it. So he thinks, I'm not making it. He sinks his head in despair, and he thinks, I'm not going to make it. It has all been for nothing. How do I ever find gnosis? And then, Hermes said, okay, maybe it is possible. And there you see the beginning of a kind of a ceremonial technique that is described. And you have to fill in things here. So you have to fill in what they might actually be doing, because it isn't spelled out explicitly. But if you connect the dots, then I think what's happening is that Hermes tells Tot that, okay, basically you have to be silent, don't speak. I imagine Tot lying down and maybe getting into some kind of meditative state, something like that. It's harder to say. And then Hermes starts to invoke 10 powers of light, and the 10 powers of light start driving out the 12 powers of darkness from the body of Tot. And the book, so this is what you find on the cover of the book. This is, of course, William Blake, and of course it describes God creating Adam. But I think you can also look at this cover, this picture. Just imagine that this is Hermes Trismegistus, and this is the pupil Tot, who is in a kind of an entranced altered state. And Hermes is here exorcising his body. You see here these snake-like tentacles here that represent something like the dark powers that are being driven out of the body of Tot. So that's why I chose this cover, this picture. So, what's happening? And I have to give some background explanation again.
Please.
So the real story is, so the story is this, that so the moment a soul is born in the body, so you go through all the planetary spheres and you finally end up in a body. And this happens at a specific time and a specific place, right? So you are born in a specific place, obviously, and not in this place and not in any other place. So think about this as like a kind of mathematical grid. So you can pinpoint somebody's location, right, in a kind of yeah, mathematically, this is where you're born. But at the same time, you can also pinpoint the moment this person is being born, and that is done astrologically. Because you can think of the heavenly bodies as a gigantic clock. Any specific moment in time is defined by the exact moment where all the planetary bodies, so all the heavenly bodies, are at that specific moment. A few seconds later, something has already shifted, and the stars are not exactly, and the heavenly bodies are not exactly in the same place anymore. And so this is the element of astrology which points to the specific quality of time. Any moment is different from any other moment, and any moment is defined by the exact location of all the planets. That's so you think of the planets as kind of a heavenly clock. Now, if you think about it like that, you're being born at a specific place and a specific time that's unique. There is no other place and time like that, only that place. And the moment you're born, there are daimonic beings, so, you know, spiritual entities, let's say, that are linked to the specific heavenly bodies at that specific moment. And the way I try to describe it, this is like you have this gigantic grid, like think about a matrix, like a grid of vertical and horizontal lines, right? And here comes the soul that appears in matter, in the body. It's born. And suddenly there's this blip on the radar, and suddenly, oh, there's a new person being born, right? In time and space. The moment that this happens, the daimonic entities that preside over that time and place notice the presence of a newborn and immediately invade the body of the child. And this happens to all of us. So it happens to you, it has happened to me, everybody, without exception. The moment we are born, according to the Hermetic authors, our bodies and our souls get invaded by the precise astrological daimons that have to do with this specific time and place. And they stay, and they stay there for the rest of our life, normally, mostly. And there's one beautiful text, I think, in the Hermetica, which says that, well, they are in our body, they are in your blood, they are in your guts, they are in your brain, they are everywhere. They have inhabited your body. And these daimonic entities are responsible for, how do you say, for binding the soul to the body and limiting it in the body. And so that you only see one specific time and one specific place. So I cannot function in the body if I see everything at the same time. What I see is my room right now. I see the screen with you there. I know that I'm at this specific moment. I'm not in the past. I'm not in the future. I'm here now. Be here now. You know. So,
yes.
That is why. So, and that is what you need in order to function normally. But it is the daimonic entities that do that bind our soul to the body in this way, so that we are focused in time and space. At the same time, these daimonic entities are also responsible for the emotional passions that dominate our consciousness. That's very important here. So for the Hermetic authors, the body is not bad. The body is neutral. It's just a body. What's problematic is the passions that dominate our consciousness, the emotional passions, like lust, like anger, like grief, like sadness, like all this kind of passionate, emotions that we feel and that dominate us in all kinds of ways. And they are steered, so to speak, by the daimonic entities in us. So, so you're born at a specific moment, specific astrological moment, which means that you're extra susceptible, let's say, to getting angry. So, let's say I have a tendency to get angry easily. That's because I have a very strong daimon in me that makes me angry, that fires my passion of anger, and it is astrologically based. Someone else might be prone to depression. It's a strong depression daimon in him or her, and so on and so forth. So this is the whole constellation of emotions. And so those are the limiting conditions. That is why we suffer. we suffer not because of the body, but we suffer because of our passions in our body, which which make us feel anger and sadness and grief and all these kind of things. And they draw us away, so to speak, from seeing reality as it really is. They cloud our consciousness. They lead us into a kind of a maze of hallucinations, basically. So that's what we're doing. All of us are hallucinating our way through our life, basically, under the influence of these demonic entities in us. So that's more or less what they say. That's what you read here. Now, okay, now I'll get back to the text finally. Sorry for the long explanation.
No, but to say that
this is essential for understanding what's happening here.
But the value here is psychotherapeutic on some level. Like so to experience joy, to have the capacity for joy, there's something about shame, and to need to eat means that I can have too little or too much, that the nature of how I approach something like eating can deplete me or can exaggerate that need so that I'm burdened by the too muchness, and so therein lies the suffering. And so these folks are really looking at the psychotherapeutic, the soul work of how to cleanse a body that's simply being a body. And if we can get out of this, oh shit, you're so self-important, but know that self-importance is related to something that's a natural expression of human existence, it's just out of sync. It's become greedy or too much or too little. And that these processes are the cleansing processes of that nature.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Just want to say
that.
Okay.
Absolutely. And I'm happy that you mentioned the psychotherapeutic, because that's true. I think that a lot of the Hermetica has to be read psychologically and psychotherapeutically. It is about healing the soul. It's really about healing the soul from negative influences, from negative energies and so on. It's really, really about that. And absolutely. And the element of addiction is important. We basically get addicted to these demonic energies. They addict us. They bind us to. They limit our freedom. Now that is really what they say.
So good. It's so good.
Addiction. I know. It's fantastic. It's very impressive. So, and coming back to the text. So now, what happens here is, and this I think is a key moment in the way of Hermes, as it's called, or the path of Hermes. So Tot is lying there in a kind of an entranced, altered state. It's not entirely clear what happens, but something like that. And Hermes starts invoking 10 powers of light that drive out the 12 powers of darkness. Now, the 12 powers of darkness are 12 because they're linked to the zodiac, for reasons I just explained. They're linked to the zodiac. So there are 12 of them. And so they're named, all 12 of them. I do not have the list here, but grief and lust, and et cetera, et cetera. So you have all 12 of them. And they're driven out. Driven out by what? By the powers of light. And there are 10 powers. Again, why 10? Well, because of the Hermetic universe has 10 levels, as I just said. So you have the Pega, you have the Ennead, you have the Octawat, and then you have the 7 planetary levels. So what happens is that Hermes invokes 10 powers of light. First 7 linked to the planets, and they, one by one planet drives out its corresponding demonic entity. Then the second drives out another demonic entity. So all 7. Then in the end, 5 of the 12 demonic powers are left, right? And then suddenly the highest 3 powers of light arrive altogether. So the powers of the 8th and of the 9th and of the source itself, of the good. And they together arrive, and they, like I write it in my book, like they blow away, the rest of the 5 entities, like, in some kind of final burst of energy. So now all the 10 powers of light have arrived, they have come down, and they take the place of the demonic powers in Tot's body, and they weave themselves into a new body. And so the demonic powers are gone, And instead, there's this new body of light, of spiritual light, that is now taking the place of the daimotic powers. Now, this is something that almost never happens to normal human beings. Most of us will die with those diamonds in us, because that is just the way it is. But so the claim of these of Corpus Hermeticum 13 is that it is possible for a small elite, for people who are really, really dedicated, to reach the point that Tot reaches here, in which he can be reborn, his diamonds are driven out, and a new body of light takes its place. Now, that happens here. It's very rare and special. So this is a condition for gnosis, to be reborn like that. And the moment that this happens, Tot immediately exclaims what happens to him. His consciousness has changed radically. And what happens is exactly what you could expect. His consciousness is no longer bound to time and place. It's no longer bound to time and place because the diamonds are gone. And therefore his body is limitless. Sorry, his consciousness is limitless. It is no longer bound to time and space. And so you hear him saying, I'm everywhere. I'm in here, I'm in India, I'm on the other side of the universe. My consciousness is everywhere at the same moment. And it is at every time. I'm in the past, I'm in the future, I'm in the present. And this description of the kind of universal cosmic consciousness, literally cosmic consciousness of Tot, you also find in another text of Hermetica, Corpus Hermeticum 11, where I have a very beautiful, very poetic description of this state, which is called becoming the ion. So there you have the term becoming the ion, which means becoming. Basically, it means becoming or changing your consciousness into the consciousness of God himself. Because that's the point. God himself is beyond time and space. God's consciousness is everywhere. It's not limited to a place or a time. And the moment the pupil gets reborn into the body of light is equivalent to the body of God himself. It is total light and it is everywhere. And so this is not a situation like the Gnostic story where the spark of light reunites with the great light up there and leaves the body. It's rather another way of thinking about it. It means that our consciousness becomes the consciousness, comes to participate in the consciousness of God himself. So we see what God himself sees. God sees everything and everywhere at the same moment. And so do we at the same, everywhere and all moments and all places at the same time. Sorry,
yeah, you're not going anywhere, you're really seeing. Yeah. You see. I want to read this because it's such an important paragraph.
Yeah.
It's from you're on page 214.
Yeah.
And it is it looks like 11, chapter 11. So all beings are in God, not as though they were in some place, but in a different manner. They rest in his incorporeal imagination. Yes. You must conceive of God as having all nomata in himself.
Noemata, actually, noemata.
Noemata, thank you. That's my Greek lesson for the day.
That's right.
Those of the cosmos himself, the all. Therefore, unless you make yourself equal to God, you cannot understand noesai, God. Like is understood only by like. Allow yourself to grow larger until you are equal to him who is immeasurable. Outleap all that is corporeal, transcend all time, and become the ion. Then you will understand. Noesis, God.
There you go. That's it. So this is an extremely important moment. Yeah.
I read that and just sat there and stared at it for about 5 minutes. I mean, to me, that was the essence of essence. Like it, just thank you for exposing me to this series of words that make so much sense to me, that help open portals, it seems. I'm just... So this idea of it crashes so much of the fundamental structure of my own theological orientation, and that this kind of hierarchical dynamic where this flaw here and beauty there and inaccessible, it just collapses the whole thing, and
Yeah. Yeah.
it's magic.
Yeah, it is absolutely true. It is complete. I mean, even thinking. I mean, we know it's absolutely. I had similar experience. It is very, very impressive, and it's true. I mean, even thinking hierarchically about. So we tend to think the source is up there, right, and then you have the nous, and then under that you have the eight, and then you have the planetary spheres. But actually, not even that is correct because there is no space.
Yeah,
So
yeah, it all goes.
so it's not like the eight sphere is stacked on top of the cosmos and the night up above that. No, there is no space. There's no space.
Yeah. How do you categorize when you're talking about that which is beyond categorization? Yet we have to categorize it. That's that confusing space of I'm in it, just to know, yes, I'm in a dual existence, and this is the folly and the humor and the joke. The cosmic joke of my existence is the struggle that I experience in duality.
Mm, mm. Yeah, that's very hermetic to put it like that. Yeah. No, definitely. No, absolutely.
I think I found my people, Wouter. I don't know.
No, you know what is so impressive is that these texts were written in the 2nd, 3rd century, somewhere around that time. As I explained, they have gone through being copied and recopied, and people have made mistakes and have added words to it and interpretation. So this gone. So so much has happened over so many centuries to these texts, and nevertheless, we have them now, and these are deep, impressive texts. They have somehow something essential has survived in spite of everything, and you know, I have to say that I feel a bit protective on behalf of the text. So many earlier scholars, earlier 20th century, have dismissed the Hermetic literature like second or third hand philosophy, like feeble minds who were not really understood the depths of philosophy. Bullshit, really. These are very very complex, very sophisticated texts. And I personally think there must have been some kind of original genius behind this. And so we do not know. I can only speculate, but I write a little bit about this in chapter 9. There is the story, there's Hermes Trismegistus, right, who is the kind of archetypal teacher in the text. And then there are these references to his own master, Agathos Daimon, the good Daimon. And what Hermes says is that Agathos Daimon was his teacher, and he never wrote anything down. Never. He just spoke orally. And so there is this kind of vague idea of the presence of some guy in the Fayum area, maybe there in ancient Egypt. I think, but I cannot prove this. This is speculation on my part, but I think there has been some very, very brilliant person there at this time, some kind of charismatic personality with brilliant insights, who has been gathering a small community around himself, and from there on the tradition has continued. Simply because if you read these texts from this perspective and you are attentive to the psychological and the psychotherapeutical aspects and all that, then, I mean, the more I read it, the more impressed I am. This is deep stuff. It's deep stuff.
It's some of the deepest I've ever. And there's this really interesting connection with the Tibetan tradition that I find to be fascinating. I recently revisited an interview that I did with a fellow named Neale, who's a psychologist and Tibetan practitioner. He wrote a book called Gradual Awakening. He's very astute and incredibly well spoken. But in thinking about this material and also listening to him, he talks about this state of deathlessness. And to me, the deathless state is is the ion. There's a deathless. Once you experience your own death and you merge into this oneness of deathlessness, and to then come back, so to speak, again, words are words, but come back into this embodied existence, you're totally transformed.
Yeah.
And his forthcoming book is called The Elixir of Life. And the way they frame this is that you, in the heart, it's not the measurable heart, but in the heart center, these processes create droplets, and these droplets are the elixir of immortality. And immortality is not envisioned as this body would envision immortality, and that I live forever, but that I've achieved, the practitioner has achieved a state of deathlessness that merges with this ion and becomes the God experiencing itself in a cosmic loop. And the difficulty, though, that Miles and I talked about is coming back from the mountaintop and saying, how do I now live a human existence,
Right.
experiencing what I've experienced?
Yeah. Now, there are two things that I think about when I hear you say this. I mean, this makes a lot of sense. One thing is, what do you do afterwards when you come down the mountain? So let's come back to this in a moment.
Yeah, good.
The other thing is death, life and death. One point I make in my book is that for the Hermetic practitioners, death does not exist.
Yes.
There is no such thing. There is only life, and this has to be understood radically. There is only life, nothing else. But the interesting, so what they understood as death was not the death of the body, because the body recycles and the soul just goes on. Nothing ever really dies, and they're very explicit in the text. There's a whole series of points where they say this: death does not exist. Period. But what does exist is a state of death, and kind of state of limited consciousness in which we are not entirely aware of life. And so the only thing that exists is life. The universal life is the universal light and life of the Ennead or the octawatt of the highest spheres, universal life. But when you get embodied in the body, then you forget perceiving life as it really is, and you fall into a state of death, into a death state. So we think we are alive, right? And then after death, we are dead. It's actually the other way around. We are dead.
Yes.
And when we die, we become alive. We become aware again of the universal life. It's exactly the other way around. And but it is fascinating because so they do play with the life and death, death terminology. And there's one passage in one of the texts where they talk about the ultimate state, and they call it the death state. But the understanding is the death state is actually the state of life. And so they keep, playing with these dualities.
Well, it's a weird, because you're using the dual language to express something, and to flip it, to be dead. I am dead. And what does that do for my existence when so much of my life has been structured on this ultimate fear of of the impermanence of my life? And in facing that, it creates a totally transformative reality that all of our conditions are put into question, and it's a like the real spiritual path becomes one that is not about how you bow and how you say 10 things in this order and that order. Those are important, I think, because and I want to get into this because you speak a lot about ritual and about music and about certain kind of sonic, vibrational structures that do the unlocking, that participate in the unlocking.
Right.
But that state of the flip, that no, I'm dead, is it's a radically different.
Use the word of flip, like our friend Jeff.
Jeff talks about. That's right. It's funny. I was thinking about. I just have his book that just came here, brand new, and it gets into a lot of this material that you and he, of course, share. And it's hard not to think about him in this conversation, because we're talking about what can completely reorient these fundamental associations of our existence. One of those things is trauma.
Yeah.
And I think he talks quite a lot about how trauma kind of cracks open for the paranormal. The other, of course, I think, are these drugs that people have created and take. Going into caves and sensory deprivation, starving yourself and being physically exerting yourself, chanting and being in community, being held by other people. And then these small communities of people are built or grow around these experiences.
Yeah.
And this Hermetica is, I've just not been exposed to a text that I feel so brought home to.
I'm very impressed myself also. Yeah.
Yeah.
I say no. I mean, you're just. I've been living with those texts for years and years, and it's just really. And I, as I say on the very final page of the book, I'm absolutely sure that when I return to this text, I will start seeing new dimensions that escape me. And this is not going to stop. These are profound texts. These are like classical literary texts. Like they do not get exhausted.
Well, you're talking about what you said at the beginning. I'd like to talk about what you said at the end. At the beginning, you talk about how any author puts a spell on you, and this magic that
right
can entrance you and take you into places you've not otherwise been. This book certainly did that. You accomplished your task of putting a spell on me as a reader, and
that is what I hoped.
I'm hooked, Wouter, totally hooked. So I want to be respectful of time and any threads, because we've certainly been going for a while, and I know you got to go.
No, there are two things. I have a bit more time. I have half an hour maximum as far as I'm concerned. Then I have to go.
Good.
But maybe two things. Maybe we haven't talked about yet.
Good.
I think one is the ascent to the octawat and the ennead. That's very important, and because you talked about the rebirth, becoming the ion.
Yes.
To finish this, I think we have to say something about it. And the second thing you mentioned earlier is, okay, then you come down from the mountain. What are you going to do?
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
So shall we talk a little bit about that? Is that
please?
Okay?
Yes, these are great. These are great.
Because I feel, if I want to give kind of a complete picture, I think we have to talk about it. So there is this text transmitted only in Coptic, the octawat and the ennead, the 8th and the 9th. And so this is a text in which you see, again, Hermes and Tot. And Tot is now reborn, so he has become the ion. He has universal cosmic consciousness. All of that is there, but then there's still another step you can take, and that is described here. And this is actually here we see him going beyond the cosmos, because becoming the ion means cosmic consciousness in the literal sense. You are everywhere in the cosmos, but you're not beyond the cosmos yet. That happens in the 8th and the 9th, and it's a long story, but there is at one point there, at crucial points, there is an invocation of the Greek vowels. So Greek has 7 vowels, and they are used in a ceremonial manner. Now you have in the text, you have this kind of triangle, like you have one alpha, which is the first letter of the Greek alphabet. And then you have the epsilon and the iota, etc. So you have one alpha, and they're followed by 2 omegas, which is the last of the 7 vowels. Then you have 2 epsilons followed by 3 omegas, then 3 of the next followed by 4, 4, 5, 5, 6, 7, 8. So you get an expanded, triangle of longer and longer strings of vowels, Greek vowels. Now, this is well known. You find this in the text, and what to do with it. And you find such vowels in other manuscripts in this period as well. And so my interpretation, I have to say this is one of the things I'm most proud of, because I don't think anybody has ever suggested that. And for some reason, so I think I discovered this. Maybe because I have a musical background, I studied music in the past. And the thing is that, so you have the 7 vowels. The 7 vowels are linked to the 7 planets of the cosmos. That is well known. So each of them stands for one of the planets. But then you can also link them to the 7 tones of the scale, of the musical scale. And then you can sing them. And this is not speculation. There are very authoritative texts that explain how the vowels and the planets and musical notes can be linked with each other. So if you see this, then you can see that this series of vowels is not just, these people are not just standing there, ah, oh, no, that's not what they're doing. They're singing, they're vocalizing it on tones. And you can sing. You can sing it. And actually, somebody has made a very nice recording of it. I have it somewhere. Yeah.
Oh,
wonderful. Yeah. I don't think I have it here. I don't know whether. Well, actually, if this works, I could actually. Maybe I can.
Oh yes, I see where you're going.
Can I do this? Shall I try this? If this
you should
works?
try this. Yes, you should try this.
So the only thing I have to say here, to have it right, what you should hear is you should actually have a single voice singing a tone and answered by a choir, by a larger group, and then a single again. That's not possible. Here you hear only one voice, so it is not entirely what it should be. But it sounds more or less like this. Hopefully this works. 1 second. So maybe we shouldn't play the whole one. But this is more or less what it is.
Thank
and
you.
And every time you hear the low voice, that should actually be a larger group of people. Oh, right now.
Yeah. That's beautiful. Thank you.
And this is Louis Calero. I would like to give him credit.
Good.
Wonderful. He's a musicologist, I think, and a singer. And he spontaneously made this recording for me. That's wonderful.
Oh, what a gift.
So, yeah. So what happens is that this is what they do. You must imagine Tot and Hermes standing in a circle, surrounded by the brethren who have already been reborn. So all these people have gone through the rebirth. They have become the ion. And then the pupil and the master, Tot and Hermes, are standing in a circle. I think that they are holding each other by the shoulders. There is one moment in the text where Hermes says, my child, that's how they say, they address it to each other, my child, let us embrace in love. Let us embrace in love. And after that, the whole ascent of the soul starts. And people usually think, well, it's a kind of a beer hug, you give each other a hug, like let's embrace. But I think it's probably, I cannot prove this is speculative, but I think that actually they hold each other by the shoulders, so they make a connection, a kind of an energetic kind of connection, and they keep standing there for the whole duration of the ceremony. Because what happens then is that from that moment on, the powers of light come down. That's what you read in the text, and they ignite the power that has been sent upwards by the voices of those people. So these powers of light, meet. By the way, are you still there, John? Yeah. Because sometimes you freeze, and I'm not sure whether you still hear me. Okay, good.
Thanks for checking.
So they and the moment that these powers going up through the voices and the powers of the light coming down meet, there is a kind of an ignition, and then suddenly the mind of, or the consciousness of Tot is opened, and he sees the Pege, the source. And he sees this universal boundless light of Nous, and he sees the souls around him, which are singing. And so you have this spectacular moment of total gnosis, in which he perceives the souls, the light, and even the source itself. And the first thing he says is, it's impossible to express this in words.
Yeah.
And but he addresses his master, Hermes, who keeps saying, I am the nous. So they have the nous again. So Hermes says, I am the light itself. And you are the light also. So both of us are light, and there's no distinction. So you have the non-duality again of the observer, who is the same as what is being observed. Okay, all kinds of things happen. They have a whole dialogue, and this goes in details. And then they start actually hearing the voices of the souls in the eighth sphere who are singing to the nous, and so that's a kind of a celestial hymn that's going on there. And then, well, finally this ends with another series of vowels, and then they are back to earth, and that is the end of the experience. And it's it's a very powerful, ultimate experience that is being described here. Yeah.
Well, man, like, there's things we attempt in concerts all the time, but that.
Yeah, and there is a passage which says that the Egyptian priests used to sing vowels like this, and apparently this was well known that priests could do this, and people listened to it because of the euphony of those sounds, like they listen to it like you listen to a musical instrument, something like that. So apparently this was very impressive as a performance, and somehow it induced an altered state, a radical altered state of radical unity. And whether other things like substances or so were involved, again, we do not know. It is just a totally open question.
It's easy to jump in there and say, I don't know if there had to have been, but in our current context, there seems to often have to be. And who knows why? That may be a huge statement, but you just think about these, whether you're down in South America, or you've got, what Carl Ruck has been talking about with whether it's Eleusis or the Amanita muscaria, like all these different sacramental substances that on some level intuitively, I would think that then everybody would kind of join together around that particular instrument of this alternate state. But I certainly understand that I don't know what it would be like to fast and then go into a cave for 7 days.
Yeah, I mean, so many of the circumstances we do not know about.
Right.
So we do not hear where this happens. You can speculate it's in the desert, maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe it does happen in a cave, maybe in a sanctuary. We do not know. They do not explain. Now we burn Kufi incense or something like that. Some of these things, sometimes people, the kind of things that everybody knows, are not written down because everybody knows that you do. So, but okay, I don't want to go speculating here about things we do not know. On the one hand, you might hypothesize that something like that's going on. On the other hand, I think it was much more common in these cultures and periods to altered states. I think were seen as less uncommon than they are nowadays.
I totally get that.
There's a wonderful book by Julia Ustinova, a fantastic scholar of Greek ancient religion, who has written a whole book, Mania, ancient Mania in ancient Greece, and who is, she knows all the classical Greek literature, and she's written a large book with all the evidence for altered states in Greek antiquity. So exactly in the place where many people think this is the culture of Greek rationalism, well, actually it's full of altered states. And it's not just so, and substances are just a small part of it. So I think we have to be careful before we jump to.
I take that that concern. So you were also talking about the coming down from the mountaintop.
Right, that's the final thing. Yeah. So that's my 10th chapter. So at the end of this text, the Octa of the Lienia, then you see a kind of a strange epilogue in which Hermes and and Tot are just talking after the ritual. And I begin the chapter like, the ritual is over, the candles have been put out, the incense has wafted away, and now they find themselves talking about what the hell just happened. And yeah, basically that's what you see there. It's a bit of a strange text. I think it stands on its own. There's some things to be said about it, but there's something strange about it. It's a point that I find important in my final chapter, and that is that so the reason I say this, you'll have to read the book. I cannot explain it now; it's a bit too technical. But at the end of the text, it's no longer Hermes Trismegistus who's talking, but suddenly we are talking with the ancient god Tot, who was one of the great deities of the Egyptian pantheon. So the great deity, who also appears in a famous text by Plato, the Phaedrus, and here you see the same god Tot, who appears in front of the ultimate god Ammon, the highest god in the pantheon, and he has Tot has invented language, or not language. He has invented writing, specifically writing. And he comes in front of the throne of Ammon and he says, well, Ammon, I've made this fantastic discovery, writing. So now people will be able to remember things that otherwise they would forget. And this is a great thing. So I ask you to, disseminate this great gift and, among the Egyptians. So this is Plato. And then Ammon is not so impressed, or maybe he is impressed, but he doesn't like it. So he tells Tot, well, this gift that you have invented of writing, you have not actually discovered a medicine for remembering, but just a medicine for reminding. Not the same thing. Mm-hmm. And he uses the word medicine, which is pharmakon in Greek, of course, on the basis of pharmacy, etc. Pharmakon. And the pharmakon can be a medicine of healing, but it can also be a poison. And it can be all these things in between. And so he says, you have created a pharmakon, and it's actually, you claim that this is a great thing, which will, help people remembering things. Mm-hmm. But he says, actually, people will get distracted by this pharmakon.
Wouter, hang on. Sorry. I have an invader right here in this very wonderful movement. Hi.
Fantastic. Okay. Hi.
Hi, honey. Say hi to Wouter. Say hi. Wouter, this is Sufi.
Hi, Sufi.
Daddy. He's saying hi, huh? I gotta keep going, okay?
Can I have gum?
I love you. Yes, you may. Here.
Thank you.
Will you shut the door on your way out? Have a great day at school, honey. Love you, sweetheart. Mwah. Thank you. Sorry.
That's a very nice kind of invaders that you
have. those are good invaders. That's right. Okay, great. Continue.
Okay, all right. So So we have this fascinating and very famous debate between Tot and Ammon in Plato. And so is writing something great, something good, or is it a delusionary thing that actually fools us into thinking that we know something, whereas in fact it makes us forget what it's really all about? And so there's this, then I use Jacques Derrida, the famous French philosopher, who has written a famous text about this. And I go into greater detail about this, and I won't try to do that here. But so the question is, at the end of the Octavot and the Ennead, Hermes tells Tot, write it all down so that the memory will not be forgotten. So in other words, he commands him to write it down, even to engrave it in stone, so that future generations will be able to read it. Well, of course, we are reading this text now 2,000 years later, or 1,800 years later, and so we are now reading this pharmakon, this writing, and the question is, who is right? Is Tot right or is Ammon right? thought seems to have a positive perspective and to say, well, by means of writing, I can tell you about what happened to us. But Ammon says, no, you cannot write it down because the experience is inexpressible in language. Lesson cannot. So you will tell people, you will give them the illusion that they understand what this is all about, but actually they don't understand. But you will be fooling them. You will giving them. You will be leading them astray by language, by writing, because they will. And literally, the text says in Plato that they will know of they will seem to know of many things, although in fact they are ignorant and unpleasant too. So because inflated, they will seem to know all these things by writing, but they will have lost contact with the real thing that it's all about, which cannot be written down. So, okay, now here you are confronted with the essential question about Hermetic spirituality. Gnosis cannot be expressed. And all we know about Hermetic literature is writing, pharmacon, which can only falsify the content, but cannot actually translate or transmit it. So this is the big dilemma. We are reading this now. You're impressed by the text. I'm impressed by the text. And we think we understand something about it. But actually, if you take them seriously, they're saying, no, you cannot understand it. You have to do it. And otherwise, nothing in the text can transmit the knowledge that it's all about. Well, so this is the big dilemma.
And for me, it taps into, I mean, there's a reason why it's called the way. You know, to me, it reveals something. It's not so much about, let me take this thing literally, because that what somebody said back then is something that I need to replicate. But it feels like a familiar traveler. And so that by being in relationship to that, it's a home. It's kind of a home, a feeling like coming home, and if you can remember that and hold it lightly and gently, but also know that the inevitability of the nature of being human is to grasp. And then eventually know that you'll need to be cleansed of all the shit you held on to. You know, then you're in this process. But what comes up for me, Wouter, as you're talking about this, is that I certainly take for granted something like writing, and even to hear this concept of a conversation about writing as medicine, that changes everything. You know,
but the question is, is the medicine or is the poison?
And and when do you apply it, and how do you apply it, and have you learned the craft? You know, are you respectful, and do you have reverence to the craft?
Reverence. That's another word
that came up in your book.
It's not coincidental that you use that word. Reverence, aisebeia in Greek, is the key virtue in the Hermetica. That's important. We didn't mention it yet, but the key virtue. So ultimately, it's not the ultimately most important thing is not even to have gnosis. Gnosis can only be attained by very few people because it's too difficult. But all of us can have reverence. That's what they say. And whether you have achieved gnosis or not, you can be reverent. That means you can be respectful with you can treat the whole world around you and everything that's in it in a respectful manner, not just respect, but you can recognize how awesome it is with awe, actually, and how you can recognize the fact, this is really emphasized strongly in the Hermetica, that we are living in this. So it might be difficult to live in the body and the material and the passions that poison our consciousness and all these kind of things. But ultimately, we are living in a spectacular world that comes out of the source, which is totally good and beautiful and true. And if we do not see the goodness and the beauty and the truth, that it is because of our limited consciousness. But reality is good. It's beautiful and it's true. Those three things. That is what it really. So, and we are surrounded by it, and it's the only thing that really is. And so, the only thing that cannot be forgiven by the gods, we read at one passage, is irreverence. If you just respond to this enormous gift of life light, of reality, with if you dismiss it, if you treat it with irreverence, with lack of respect, with and that is the greatest vice, actually. Ignorance can be forgiven. We are all ignorant, and it's difficult to know, really. And the gods can forgive that. What they cannot forgive is irreverence. And this is actually a very important key aspect, I think. It tells you something about how you should live your life in the world.
How you come down from the mountaintop.
Yeah.
And there's something about to look at all of existence with reverence is to see that expression of the all, or the universal oneness, or cosmic whatever, God, in the other, in all of it, in the threads of the rug, in the frog, and the guitar, and the singing voices, and the other person. And that seems to be the spark, like, how does one live in accordance with that perspective? And then how does that perspective change one's life? And I would argue something that I don't think is necessarily true, that I think this is to your point. Even without the gnosis, there is something divine about having that shared, or desiring to see existence in that way. So whether you have this kind of ion experience, or just work consistently to love, to connect, and to see the beauty of all, that's a life well lived.
No, but that is exactly, then you come back to Diotima. So what it's all about, love, eros, is about giving birth in the cave. So that is what it's all about. It's not about finding this ultimate bliss of perfect knowledge. That's nice, that's great for a few elite people, but it's really about embodying the good, the beautiful, and the true. That is what it's about.
Oh.
That's what you find in the symposium, and that is what the Hermetica says, and that's what Hermeticism says as well. That is really the key.
Wouter, I want to begin closing, and of course what that means is opening to anything that we've not said. Of course I'm going to ooze gratitude, because I've just been reading this book for the past number of weeks, and I'm a beneficiary of your work. And in this case, I consider you writing this down to be a gift, and it's not a poison.
Oh, thank you very much.
It's a medicine. Well, is there anything else, any other thread that's kind of left hanging that you?
I think we've covered pretty much everything, as far as I can tell.
Yeah.
All details, but no, I think this was pretty comprehensive, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, me too. I'm looking over all my questions, and I think we got it. So,
okay. Fantastic.
Again, thank you. This conversation, I have my secret is that I get to both have the conversation, and then I get to re-listen to the conversation. So I have a first, maybe I can say I have a first, second, and third perspective on this work. So I sit here very eager to go back through, and it'll probably be ready in about 3 or 4 weeks.
No, that's great. But I want to thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk. It is such a nice conversation about this. Because like I said, it's a book that I care about a lot.
I can tell.
And it's wonderful to have the chance of explaining it a bit in this way. So thanks a lot also.
Such a gift. Thank you for making the time, Wouter, and
Sure.
I am totally grateful. I'll just include your website. Is there anything else that you think people need to know about how to reach you, or reach your work? Because you have a great website with tons of information and articles and access. So I urge people to check that out.
I think the website is the most important thing. Yeah.
Okay.
The rest, everything, everybody can find it.
Well, with all of my heart, thank you for the time.
No, thank you very much.
Control.